Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Ivo Dalla, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's really my pleasure this morning to welcome all of you here to Chicago in the room, and to all of our viewers who are watching us through live streaming around the world. The Council is grateful to our expert speakers for participating in this symposium today. And of course, we thank the Stewart Family Foundation for their very generous support of what everyone who I've met already this morning has said is an extremely timely project. I want you to know that we announced and thought about doing a populism conference well before Foreign Affairs decided to devote initiative to it. We were founded in 1922. The Council on Global Affairs is an independent and nonpartisan organization that provides insight and influences the public discourse on critical global issues. And none of the issues we are facing today, here in the United States and across Europe and the rest of the world, is frankly more important than the future of global engagement, particularly whether the world will continue to be an open one or whether it will become increasingly closed. For 70 years, the world has been increasingly open, with ever greater numbers of people and goods crossing borders. But now we are seeing strong forces urging that we close those borders, that we build bigger fences, better walls, that we slow the trade in goods and services across borders, and to keep a stronger guard. This critical question of whether the world is open or closed goes to the heart of today's symposium on populism. The rise of populism has become one of the most important developments of the past year in our politics here in the United States, in Europe, and increasingly in Asia and other places around the world. In doing so, populism has reframed the conventional terms of political debate in ways that may have far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate elections in our countries. This symposium will try to shed some light on what is behind the rise of populism and what the possible consequences of its rise might be. We will ask such questions as, why are populist parties and sentiments gaining more prominence today? Why are so many people seemingly losing faith in established political parties and political processes? Is this a short or a long-term phenomenon? And what might it mean for America's and indeed for the world's role in and around the globe? I look forward to an important conversation that we will have not only with our expert speakers, but with everyone here in the room and around the world watching us through live streaming. Please note that the views expressed by speakers today are their own, and they do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Nevertheless, of course, we want you to express your views and do so strongly and forcefully. This symposium is on the record. It's being live streamed, as I mentioned. It would be helpful if you could silence your phones, though I would also encourage you to participate in the conversation on social media, and you will have on our screens all the information necessary for doing so. Now, it's my great pleasure to have the symposium opened formally by the Executive Director of the Stewart Family Foundation, which has been so generous in its support of our work, Truman Anderson.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Stewart Family Foundation, I welcome you to what I'm sure is going to be an unusually timely and important discussion. The Soviet Union first came apart in 1991. The further progress of liberalism seemed assured. Democracy, free trade, freedom of movement, more formal international cooperation seemed destined to shape the human future worldwide and in a fundamental way. I think in hindsight, we ought to have expected greater friction. Our optimism in unprecedented circumstances was perhaps excessive. But few could have foreseen that the progress liberalism has attained might cause a backlash. that in the European and American homelands of liberalism, doubt about these objectives might suddenly fracture our familiar political alignments. And yet here we are, confronting a new populist skepticism about liberalism and struggling to understand it. How we define populism is up for debate, and this is in fact the mission of our first panel this morning. But the need for deeper and more thoughtful analysis is clear. It's worth remembering that here in the United States, both the Republican and Democratic parties have faced a strong populist challenge in this presidential election. And odd as it may sound at this point in the contest, when questions of temperament and character have become paramount, there are some affinities or potential affinities between populists on the left and on the right. The same is true of Europe. The primacy of the immigration issue, where the lines between left and right are still fairly clear, tends to obscure this common ground. But the current populist wave also includes skepticism about income distribution, about the loss of national sovereignty to international organizations, about the power of financial institutions and corporations, about the benefits of free trade, about national security and terrorism, and perhaps most important, about the integrity and loyalty of seemingly insular political elites. Now, these are not issues that necessarily belong to the left or to the right, and perhaps that's the most important point. Many old assumptions about the politics of affluent democratic societies are now up for grabs. As the Brexit vote illustrated most strikingly, economic growth per se may not be sufficient to maintain the legitimacy of the liberal status quo. It's incumbent upon us better to understand these concerns as a matter of democratic principle. But the future of liberalism also demands it, because alternative parties, some of them markedly illiberal, have gained sufficient strength and momentum to disrupt its progress. Centrists, I think, have no real choice but to listen and engage. And it may be that accommodation will not only be necessary, but constructive and productive as well. I don't know that any of us feels nowadays that our institutions are functioning quite the way we would like them to. And there is unquestionably some merit to some aspects of the populist critique. I look forward very much to a lively and thoughtful discussion about these issues and more in our three panels today. Our first panel, The Rise of Populism, Trends, Forces, and Developments, will take a broad look at what populism is and what is driving its rise in the Western context. Our second panel, From Brexit to Election 2016, will take a closer look at the manifestations of populism in Europe and in the United States. And finally, our third panel, Beyond 2016, the implications of populism, will look at whether and how populism will leave its mark on our politics and societies in the longer term. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here this morning. Please join me in welcoming our first panel to the stage.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Neve King. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content here at the Chicago Council. Thrilled to have you all here, and thanks again, Truman and Ivo, for that intro. I'll just briefly introduce our panelists as you have their full bios in front of me. First to my left is Alexander Sasha Hemon, who we're delighted to have here, fiction writer, essayist, and critic. Next, we have John Judas, who's an author, The Populist Explosion, and editor-at-large for Talking Points Memo. Then we have Kas Muda, who's an associate professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And on the end, we have Daniel Landsberg-Rodriguez, who's the chief economist at Core Capital Management and a director at the Latin American region at the Green Mantle LLC. Excuse me. As Truman mentioned, we're here to try to understand populism. So to kick it off, we'd like to kind of think about the framework for understanding recent political developments around the world, especially in the US and Europe. We've seen Bernie Sanders, as is mentioned, and Donald Trump in the US, AfD in Germany, and the Brexit vote in the UK. But as we know, the word populism is quite hard to define. So let's start with that. Kas, why don't I kick it over to you about populism? How would you define it? And You're an academic authority on this topic, and we've seen the Foreign Affairs cover, American Gothic. It's about 300 meters away, so it's appropriate to kick off today's panel. What do you think is the right way to define populism, please?
So I define populism as an ideology which divides society into two homogeneous and antagonistic categories. On the one hand, you have the pure people, and on the other hand, you have the corrupt elite. And populists argue that politics should follow what they call the general will of the people. And so what's important is that it is a monist ideology, where you see the different groups as being homogeneous. Now, the question whether or not it is an ideology is a bit less relevant. A lot of people see it as a discourse or a rhetoric, and often this is more an empirical question. I mean, the argument is whether it's an ideology or just a discourse, you will only find out when they are in power. But if you actually look at both people like Orban in Hungary or Chavez in Venezuela, then you'll see that populists don't necessarily always shed this, and that's why I call it an ideology.
Okay, terrific. John, you've just released a new book, The Populist Explosion. It's actually available for sale here. How does your understanding of it compare to Kaas? I noticed that there was the essay in The Guardian that you did, and the headline was, "It's the status quo is failing," is how you put it in a headline. So who's a populist, who isn't, and kind of give us an overview of the difference between the left and the right in populism in your terms.
Okay. My view is similar to Kaas's. I see populists as basically understanding the society in terms of a conflict between people and the elite or establishment. The people are not necessarily the same from one populist to another, nor are the elite. I would say it's more like a logic or a grammar than an ideology. So, you know, let's say the Tea Party began by attacking the liberal democratic establishment, and now if you talk to somebody from the Tea Party, their main enemy is Mitch McConnell, the Republican leadership. So it really shifts. The people sometimes become the poor, sometimes the silent majority. That depends, but there's this basic conflict between the people and the elite. In my book, I talk about two kinds of populism: populism of the left and populism of the right. Both see a conflict between the people and the elite. You know, I was amazed when I first heard Donald Trump in August of 2015, because he isn't a conventional Republican at all. Here he was complaining about runaway shops, trade deals, corporations moving their headquarters overseas in order to avoid taxes. Issues, again, you might associate with the left rather than with the right. He wasn't a conventional business conservative in that sense. But he also, there was this other element of a scapegoat, an other. I think that you can argue for a restrictive policy on immigration, but again, I would point to the problems of businesses hiring illegal immigrants. He stigmatized the illegal immigrants themselves. They were rapists, they were coming over the border, terrorists. So for the right-wing varieties of populism, you have this third element, an other. Muslims, African Americans, illegal immigrants, depending upon the context. And for the left wing, it is a lower and middle, it's a vertical relationship, entirely going upwards against the elite. There isn't this other element of the other. Though, you know, historically, even in our own American Populist Party, there's an element of both involved. So that's the
broad sweep. Okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Daniel, you focused on Latin America all of your life. You're from Caracas. Can you give us a little bit of history of populism in Latin America? Some of us are familiar with the names, and you know, I think it's been around economic nationalism. Is it viable? Can you just give us a brief history so we can look at that model?
Happy to. First off, I wanted to thank you, Neve, for the invitation, for all of us here, and Ivo and Amelia. It's wonderful being on the panel, and surprising, actually, that you decided to put the Venezuelan on the extreme right of the panel. That's something that, in my experience, hasn't happened all that often, and that makes me wonder, a little bit as to what might be in store. So Latin America, I would say, it's actually at the opposite edge of the cycle that we're seeing in Europe and the United States. Populism writ large is very much on the retreat. And that's something that sort of plays into this initial question that you asked as to what populism is. In Latin America, I would agree with both Kaz and John's definitions, but in Latin America, there's another tenet which I do think is present elsewhere, which is that the war is against the elites, but it's also against institutions. Institutions are something that hold you back as a leader, not something that should be cultivated as a leader. And Latin America's penchant for populism, which predates the rise of sort of the Marxist and anti-Marxist ideology way back to the period right after the sort of independence movements, in which you had less of an ideological slant, but still a lot of highly personalistic leaders who would cultivate a loyalty based on their personality, not necessarily on their ideas. That's something that is very, very deeply ingrained, and I think is very relevant to the fact that in a country like Venezuela, you've had 26 constitutions in 200 years. You've had 19 constitutions in Ecuador. You've had 17 in Bolivia. You've had 32 in Dominican Republic. So these are countries that are keeping a constitution on average for about 7 or 8 years, maybe 10. But it's very difficult for institutions to entrench themselves to a point where they can keep a popular, let alone a populist, leader from doing essentially whatever they want. And so in Latin America, you also have to divide sort of the left from the right in populism. There are populist undertones in some right-wing leaders. I'd say most notably some of the rhetoric of Álvaro Uribe, the reliance on Twitter, on sort of messaging to the people, the kind of affectation of sort of an everyman way of speaking. That's something that we often see in populist leaders. What I think made this period remarkable for Latin America is that you had a confluence of populism and the most prolonged commodity boom in the region's modern history, which meant that the type of large promises that populists often make, and then when they're held to can't deliver on, they were able to deliver on for some time. When Hugo Chavez was first elected president of Venezuela, the price of an oil barrel was $18. Within a year of him coming to power, it was up in the 30s, and for most of his period in power, it was upwards of 70. And that's something that allowed for a fourfold rise in public expenditure, which did put some more credibility on these big promises that might not have seemed sustainable under another logic. Latin America, which was colonized by Spain, had initially a church and a state. You have your church, which provided social programs, education, healthcare, spiritual well-being, and you had your state, which provided administration. When independence came, both of those tenets sort of stayed in the purview of the new state, even once the church had left. It hasn't completely left, but had left sort of having political power on paper. You still had these expectations of government, which were very paternalistic in a sense, and which has created a great amount of a sort of general expectation as to what it is that governments should provide. Failing to provide that has in turn been very risky, and that's something that we've seen. The Latin American leaders don't tend to have 40% approval rating. Very rare to find a Latin American leader with 40% approval rating. It's 19 or it's 80. And right now we're seeing a move in which countries like Brazil, where Lula was the most popular president in the world for years, just got rid of Dilma Rousseff in sort of a goal-peachment or a coup-peachment. And that was something that happened when she was at 19% approval. Maduro, who is at 22%, is actually one of the most popular presidents who aren't new. So, for example, presidents like Macri or like PPK in Peru, they have sort of more of a benefit of the doubt because they're not blamed for the collapses that came before. And I think that the PPK election in Peru is actually very telling as to where the region is, because it's the first time in a long time that you haven't actually had a left-wing populist in the final round of an election. The left-wing populist was actually sort of taken out in the first round, and then instead of having a typical union of the center-right, which is what usually happens in first rounds in Latin America, you ended up with two center-right, one a little bit more populist, which would be Keiko Fujimori, and the populist lost. So I think you are seeing a bit of a sea change. How sustainable that's going to be, given the fact that a lot of these countries, for example, Brazil or Guatemala to a certain extent, are now moving from a paradigm of attacking the president's enemies with the law, which is sort of the traditional Latin American standard, to actually having outside organizations, either a very independent court in Brazil's case, the UN in Guatemala's, who are actually attacking on both sides. So you have an institution that's asserting itself, the judiciary, sort of irregardless of politics. And I think that that's something that we haven't really seen before, and which does potentially imply a change in this old sort of, in the traditional cycles of boom and bust, and then populist and sort of militant right reformist.
Great, thank you for that. Now moving over to Sasha. You're a fiction writer, but you're also a critic and a political commentator. I read very interesting remarks that you made about what it felt like in Yugoslavia in the lead up to the war. You described one of the leaders as having a Rodman-esque tomfoolery about him. So I think that you saw what you saw in the run-up to your war at home, and you have said that you see some of these same kind of things the same tomfoolery going on at the moment. Can you elaborate a little bit on this and tell us about how you would kind of place these in the historic context here in the US?
Well, you know, Bosnians say if you were bitten by snakes, you're afraid of lizards. So we have a huge lizard to confront these days. I have become alert, as many of us have, to the symptoms of populism and nationalism and to the first steps symptoms of fascism or whatever could lead to a social breakdown and the breakdown of infrastructure. Because I have a precedent in my own life, and I was working as a journalist back at the time when Yugoslavia was falling apart, and it wasn't quite the first row view, but it was pretty close. Trump, for instance, reminded me in some ways of the fascist and populist leaders, but not quite populist. They were on the fringes of that movement. Not only in his ideology that he projected or represented, but there were these manners, as it were, in public space that I found recognizable. The word symptoms comes to mind. For instance, saying outrageous things that are dismissed until they're solidified into public discourse, at which point they're normalized. So that Trump, you know, who remembers, I mean, we all remember, but I remember the shock of his, you know, announcement that he would run for president in August of 2015. Now, today, I think the New York Times published a spread of 2 pages of various insults and outrageous things that Trump has said. By this time, it's available at every level. I was writing, what the piece you're referring to was written for Rolling Stone. I was writing about a Serbian fascist, Vojislav Šešelj, who in 91 was a guest in a TV studio, this entertainment show, a talk show of a sort. And one of the jokes he cracked before a live audience, and live audience clapped at the time, he said, this was just as the war in Croatia was beginning, he said that he and his units, when he had already summoned units to fight in the war, that they have a new way of killing Croats with rusty spoons, because he said that when their throats are slit, the autopsy couldn't tell whether they died of tetanus or slit throat. This was before a live studio audience, and the audience clapped. They roared with laughter. But he was also talking, the other guest was this young woman, singer. She was pale with horror at what he said. But after a little while, it became normalized. It became normalized partly because there was war. I do not believe that discourse leads to action necessarily, but also discourse is symptomatic of the directions that could lead to particular kind of action. Trumpian rhetoric and the rhetoric of the right, which, there are similarities between left and right-wing populism in this country, but what is an important aspect of his discourse, of his language, of Trump's discourse, and this is also what I recognize, is an implicit or explicit promise of retributive violence, that the grievance of the mass, of the populace, right, that he represents, could only be fulfilled with some kind of retributive violence. Now, this has not advanced far enough in this country for me to, start packing food and flour in case of siege. But it is a question of, it's a difference in degree, but not in kind. This promise of retributive violence is a promise that is being lingered in front of the mass. Now, it's very possible that Trump will just drop out because he'll lose interest being a psychopath, and they have short attention span. But this need for retributive violence will find outlets in various ways. In former Yugoslavia, this project of retributive violence was channeled into Yugoslav People's Army. There was a pre-existing infrastructure that Milosevic and the Serbian nationalists could convert very easily, taking over the hierarchy and the systems of control and so on. Here, it would be harder because it's still democracy. It would be harder, if not impossible, to take over the structures of power that could effect an organized campaign of retributive violence.
Right. Thank you. John, to go back to one of the comments made in the opening remarks, and then the title, actually, of the symposium is, the rise of populism, expected or unexpected. I think Truman kind of said maybe this shouldn't be that surprising, what's happening. And a lot of the factors that are cited too, that are causing this are globalization, free trade, technology, because they've engendered deep equality due to the loss of jobs overseas and automation. But these processes have been underway for decades. Why do you think it's suddenly so strong right now? I mean, what's happened that's changed this? Because we've seen these for a long time.
Right. I'll try not to give a long answer to this because it's a complicated question. There's different kinds of populism. In my book, I really talk about populism as it's been embedded in democracies. Not Eastern Europe, not Yugoslavia, not Latin America, but beginning in America in the 1890s, goes to Europe in 1970s, and really starts to have an impact in the 1990s, and then after the Great Recession. The factors that have led, I think, to this explosion, and it really, again, it begins like 30, 40, 50 years ago, and Trump, Sanders, you have to go back to Perot and Buchanan. It's not something it just happened now. After World War II, for 3 decades, we had pretty unbroken prosperity in the country. We had a kind of social compact, New Deal liberalism. The idea was that as wages went up, as social benefits went up, profits would go up, and there was a kind of virtuous circle. As profits went up, taxes went up, you had more social benefits, more demand. Think of it as like, again, Keynesianism, a demand-driven ideology. 1970s, the boom stalls. Competition from abroad, pressure from below, the trade union movement, and this is, again, both the U.S. and Britain, again, is a key country in terms of this transformation. You get the spread of a different kind of ideology, supply-side economics, neoliberalism. In the United States, I'd say market liberalism. And the idea in this kind of, framework or worldview is that the key thing is to protect and expand profits and profitability by lowering costs, and that the profits and profitability will again redound to the benefit of all. A rising tide will lift all boats, as Reagan used to talk about. And there's 2 key aspects to that. The first is capital mobility. that corporations should be able to move to wherever they want, exchange of dollars, yen, what have you, deregulation of finance. The second idea is labor mobility. The workers should be able to go wherever they want, and in particular, unskilled, semi-skilled workers should be able to go to whatever country in Europe they want. Again, the Schengen Agreement in the late 1980s. United States, 1965 and 1990, big immigration bills that increase radically the number of immigrants coming into our country. So the effect of both of these has been to put pressure on the bottom and middle of the economy, not on the top 30%, but on the lower 70%. As long as there was prosperity, as long as the promise of this supply-side economics, market liberalism seemed to work, there was no populism. So you see that, let's just talk about the United States. You have the first inklings of populist revolt in the early 1990s with Perot and Buchanan. That's in the wake of this recession, this peculiar jobless recovery from 1991 to 1996. It dies out. And you have a boom, the internet boom begins in like the spring of 1996. And even though you have enormous income inequality during that period, that's when all the internet billionaires come into focus, there isn't any kind of populist revolt. Perot and Buchanan recede into the background. War on terror, preoccupation with that, and then we have the Great Recession. And again, it looks again to people that this promise and the worldview itself isn't articulated as some kind of ideology that everybody understands, but the aspects of it people do understand. The Nabisco company moving its Oreo plant out of Chicago, the meatpacking industry in Iowa being decimated. It used to be middle class, unionized. Both illegal immigrants and legal immigrants were brought in. Now it's a low-wage immigrant industry. And, you know, political reporters go to Iowa and they wonder, oh, my God, why in these small towns is there this anti-immigrant sentiment? Where did it come from? Well, if you know the history, there's a basis for it. So what we've had since 2008 is this kind of burst again of populism in the United States. And it is in response to the erosion, the lack of, the failure of this neoliberal worldview, economics to deliver the goods. That's the basic thing. It doesn't necessarily propose solutions that are viable. One of the characteristics of populism is that what populists generally demand are things that are perfectly conceivable but can't be realized in the present context. Bernie Sanders, Medicare for all, free college education. Now, those are things that happen Denmark, Canada, a lot of countries, but in the United States, it's inconceivable right now, given the gridlock in Congress, Republicans, Democrats, whatever. So what you have is a demand which itself separates the people from the elite. And it is the basis of saying, or trumps the wall and putting a 35% tariff on goods that a runaway shop sends back. That's not going to happen. But what it does is it creates this frontier, this barrier between the people and the elite. And that's the basis, again, of the conflict that you see in populism.
Do you think if more heads had rolled after 2008 that this might have averted some of this?
I always thought, well, you know, one of the things, again, that distinguished Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 and 34 from what Obama did was they really did go after the bankers and Wall Street. So in a sense, yeah, that created a kind of political vacuum out of which the Tea Party arose. But I think there still would have been some kind of movement and some kind of resentment. Because just this alone, that what used to, New Deal liberalism was more or less a universal program. A lot of the social programs now and a lot of the structure of taxation does take the form of the middle class subsidizing things, the unemployed, the people who don't have health insurance. So that in itself encourages a kind of conservative or right-wing populism. When you have kind of middling prosperity, people threatened in the middle, but the real damage done below. And that's again, a reason why I think in Northern Europe you have more right-wing prosperity, whereas in Southern Europe, where there's really depression-level conditions, 40, 50% unemployed among 18 to 34-year-olds in Spain, everybody's sort of thrown into the same pot. So you don't have the same kind of middle looking downwards and saying, oh, why are we subsidizing these people? What you have is more of a left-wing populism, trying to unite the middle and the bottom against the top.
Thank you. Cas, so immigration, refugee crisis, minorities in society, and changing demographics, they've all played a role in the populist discourse currently. What role do you think culture and cultural divisions between social groups plays in driving populism, and how do populists capitalize on this division?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot what John says, but if it truly was all about socioeconomics and frustrations about that, we would see a lot more left-wing populism. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of successful populist parties today are right-wing, radical right-wing nativist, with the exception really of Southern Europe. And I think very much for the reasons that John just outlined, like everyone is in the dumps, right? And so that is where the true economic crisis is, which hits everyone, and therefore socioeconomic issues are at the fore. But if the debate was truly socioeconomic, then Sanders would be the big winner and not Trump. Now, that is not to say that socioeconomic anxiety doesn't play a role, but I think it has to be translated socioeconomically, or in the US terms, racially. It's the socioeconomic anxiety translated socioculturally or racially that creates that fervor and that creates that support for radical right populists. And without the socioeconomic anxiety, they wouldn't be that high, but they would still be there. And so the argument that the crisis is the beginning, right, which John didn't make, but which a lot of journalists do make, right, is just factually wrong. Right? In 1999, the Austrian Freedom Party got 27% of the vote. Front National was already in the high of the tens of percentages. The other thing that you saw is before the economic crisis, and still today, populism is more successful, particularly right-wing populism, more successful in the north than in the south. It's actually successful in countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, all of which are not particularly hard hit by the crisis. Now, that doesn't mean that socioeconomic anxieties don't play a role. People feel that they're less well off. Right? People feel that what they have, they might lose. Right? And so that is why you don't see that really strong profile, which again in the media, there is now the only group that we talk about are white working class. Right? As if white working class people truly can decide an election. Right? They're far too small. If you look at the Trump support, it's more diverse. And then some people say, oh, that's all about race. No, there are people who still hold a job, but who feel that they're under threat, or they feel that they don't profit enough. And so it's that combination of socioeconomic anxiety and the socio-cultural translation through African Americans, through Muslims, through illegals, right, that really is at the core of this support.
Great, thanks. Sasha, the word translate has been used a lot, and you're a writer. So can you talk to us a little bit about how populists mobilize support and craft a message that resonates? How do we think about language and populist appeal?
I obsess about it, obviously, being a writer, but one of the things that is noticeable to me is, the grammar and syntax in the speech is used in those populist situations. It's important, and when Cas was talking, he was talking about the way people feel, right? So there's a certain aspect of inchoate emotions that cannot be formulated. And it's this inability to formulate that is part of at least Trumpian populism and other populisms that I know of. That is, that the policies or ideas or syntax do not have to be fully developed. The point is precisely to speak in terms of feelings, to express feelings. So and at the same time, the elite is suspect for being coherent, right? So Trump is, berating Hillary because she's prepared for debate, because she thinks about it. This goes back in many ways to I think it's an American notion that somehow feelings are more authentic than thought, but that's a different problem, a different story. But it's, in other words, for someone like Trump, or for George Bush for that matter, the fact that they couldn't put together a thought or a sentence, syntactically speaking, grammatically speaking, was not a disadvantage. On the contrary, they spoke as they felt. And so this communication of feeling operates better in mass situations. So Trump, as did many populist leaders or nationalist leaders that I'm familiar with, they fed off this energy of feeling. At some point, the kind of the reasoning that, or reasoned debate about issues, of positions and interests and all this is suspended because there's a critical mass of feelings that are passed around in a communion of the populace or of a nation, for that matter. This could, in my mind, easily lead to violence. You don't want to be in a stadium with 50,000 excited men, or 30,000 excited men and 10,000 not excited women. So this feelingness of it all, the quality of feeling, something that is not formulated, is not coherent, it also alters reality. I mean, I drove to Wisconsin and back in the past few days through Trumplandia. And what you can hear on the radio are people expressing their feelings. I mean, there's no relation, some of the things that I've heard, to any kind of checkable facts, which is really, really easy to check. Because now some of the people have entered this realm of a need to express the feeling. There's this tension and a need to affect some kind of outburst, so to speak. And this is present in language. This might be interesting, if you're a romantic poet, but in public discourse, in a society, a democracy that is one way or another based on the belief in human reason and reasonable self-interest, this leads to alteration of reality. Reality changes before our very eyes. So people talk about, on the one hand, what is happening is hard to believe. That is, we are behind in processing, I am behind in processing what is already going on. This is another symptom of an oncoming catastrophe. It could be. That is, there's a kind of a reality inertia. We believe that what we already know is more likely than we don't know. In other words, catastrophe that we should worry about is the one that is unimaginable. So if we can imagine it, then it's manageable. But the unimaginable might be already happening. So that, for instance, my mother and father were in Sarajevo as the siege was beginning, as the shooting was started, and I would call them from Chicago, and my mother would say, oh, they're already shooting less than yesterday. Because the logic of her life led to the suspension of hostilities. It just could not fit in the framework of reality that she knew. So the outrageous things, and I invite you to remember the experience of the past year and a half or so. How many times we might have thought, I can't believe this, right? This belief was an attitude, a means of perception of what was going on. This belief tells me where we are, right? That something's already happening, I just cannot fully understand it. This misunderstanding also, or inability to understand rather, is also related to the disorderly language. In other words, we're in the realm where language doesn't quite fully operate. Those who could be coherent are suspect for their coherence.
Thank you. Daniel, so, getting back to what Sasha says, like, you have catastrophe, can you imagine it or not? But, you know, you've studied Latin America where they've had populists in power. Talk to us a little bit about what happens how do they govern? How did this, give us a brief overview of, or specific examples. What can you teach us about when a populist party is in power?
Well, I think Latin America's relationship as a region with catastrophe is buoyant. It's very, you know, it's got the best earthquakes in the region. It's got the best mudslides in the region. It also has the greatest populist takeovers in the region, which is a sort of natural catastrophe from an institutional sense. I mean, if you go back to Plato's Republic, you have this sort of idea of the general sort of pervasive instability of republics as a system of government, in which the institutions that keep the republic in place breed resentment, at which point a person, usually from within the sort of ruling circle, will turn sort of class traitor. And take the masses that will turn the republic into a democracy, and then at that point, the democratic period is a transition to sort of one-person rule, sort of autocracy. And that, I think, is something that we sometimes see in the United States and in Europe. You know, the populists in the United States are billionaires, or they are people who have done well within the system. In Latin America, it tends not to be that case. Latin America is an exception to sort of Plato's sort of archetype of how these sorts of transitions should work, because the presidents tend to come from either the military or they come from sort of you know, lower class social movements. At least that has been the case in the sort of recent trend. The other thing about Latin America that you have to remember is that whereas the United States will consider itself exceptional and that it's taking the lead from no one, that it's setting the agenda, Latin America very much sort of copies off each other. So when you know, Chavez became president of Venezuela in '98 and the world didn't end, middle-class or at least right away, middle-class voters in places like Brazil, Argentina were more willing to give populist leaders like Kirchner the benefit of the doubt because they were seeing that, oh, well, Venezuela seems okay, so they were drawing lessons from neighbors rather than lessons from history. And that's something that you really have to keep in mind also when you look at, you know, when Chavez rewrote his constitution in 2000, within the next 6 years, you had 5 other Latin American countries rewriting their constitution because it was sort of topical. And usually the one thing that the constitutional changes would have in common would be that there was a stripping of term limits and a sort of de facto strengthening of the presidency. And that's something that you know, that populism tends, or at least left-wing populism in particular, tends to assume its own permanence in a way that can be deeply damaging to the sort of bipartisan dialogue or multi-partisan dialogue in some cases within the country. And I think that that's something that is sort of fundamentally different. When the populists take over traditionally, often you know, we have to be weary of dividing. You've had left-wing leadership in Latin America that has not been particularly populist. The first term of Bachelet was not particularly populist. The first term of Lula was not particularly populist. Uruguay has been left for decades. And they're more of a sort of soft Scandinavian left than what we usually think of as populistic. So populism tends to be, especially among the Latin American right, a sort of counter response to being called a fascist by the left. It's like, yeah, well, if I'm a fascist, you're a populist. But that sort of tends to glaze over some of the kind of structural differences. Fascism, at least in the Latin American experience, or sort of very right-wing military governments, have tended to co-opt institutions completely. In Latin America, usually, you've had populist movements that have essentially just knocked over institutions. Render them irrelevant, don't necessarily render them pliant. And that's something that's now changing. The chickens are coming home to roost in that respect because you have, in Latin America, which I think is interesting, because of when independence happened in the early 19th century, these were countries that were becoming republics at a time where there were only 2 republics to sort of model yourself on. There was the US, which was relatively stable, and there was France, which had, I think, 9 constitutions in a 10-year period and was cutting people's heads off. So if you're looking at those two, you end up having in Latin America presidential systems rather than legislative ones. You don't have a parliamentary system in which when that support rating drops from 89 to 19, the legislature can say, okay, well, obviously you're not going to be able to govern now, so we're going to let somebody else have a turn. Rather, you have a presidential system where you finish, even if the legislature hates you and even if the people hate you. So what you end up having, really, are these sort of cycle of coup impeachments. You have sort of politicized corruption trials, which are really just, I think, at heart, no confidence votes. In presidential systems that are essentially trying to find a path, it's a means to an end, to allow for a leadership change. And because of that, in Latin America, it ends up being a bit like a game of musical chairs. When the commodity bust happened, countries like Argentina, which were due to have an election soon anyway, they did okay. The Kirchners hung on for a little while, they weren't able to do much, then, 2015, Macri's elected. Peru, similar situation. Countries where you were earlier on in the electoral process, like Brazil and like Venezuela, which is sort of the benchmark for regional mess right now, that was something that wasn't an option. So there you have a lot more polarization, and you have these institutions that have been weakened but can't really assert themselves the way that, for example, Brazil was able to. Because you had much less of a strong populism that weakened the judiciary to the point where it couldn't do anything. That's something that in Venezuela, for example, has not been the case, because in Venezuela, the judiciary is an extension of the presidency, which means that when you have a 18-year-old or 16-year-old constitution with no precedents for a power transfer, they're basically rewriting the game in real time, which means that the judiciary, if it's a connection with the presidency, can essentially do whatever it wants, which is what we've seen. And while that's an extreme case, it does speak, I think, very clearly to the dangers of this sort of populist rhetoric of I alone can fix it, and not looking at things institutionally, but rather looking at the new government or the coming government as essentially an extension of the leader. And that's something that I think the world, in a sense, facilitates, because when we think of Latin American governments, we think of their presidents. We don't think of anything else. When Nixon resigns because the legislature was impeaching him and the court wasn't going to go his way, that's a resignation. When Zelaya does it in Honduras, it's a coup. Yeah. And so we tend to extend, or we tend to sort of assume that presidencies are governments in Latin America, and that, I think, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to a large degree.
Great, thanks. Just to pivot to Europe, Cass, on a point, well, we talk about being outside the elite. What happens, for example, when somebody gets elected in and then they become part of this political elite? How do you continue your populist movement if you're now part of what you were rallying against at one point? How does that work?
So we have this assumption that populism can only really be successful in opposition, because almost by definition, when they're successful, they become part of the elite and therefore they become victim of their own success, right? And I think that is wrong in various cases. And this relates a little bit to a point that Sasha made earlier. I think particularly here in the US, you start to see now the whole world through Trump. Right? And so it's very odd. I all the time read about the Trumpification of Britain or the Trumpification of that, describing political actors who actually predate Trump as a political actor by decades. Right? Now, Trump is truly an outsider in many different ways, an outlier in many different ways. There are a lot of populist leaders in Europe today that are actually able to speak very comprehensively and well. I mean, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Front National in France, is a very competent politician, at least in what politicians do, namely making their arguments and putting people in spots. Whether she can govern is a different matter, I don't know. But there are some really successful populists, like Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary today, who are in power. He is in power for 6 years, but is still able to create an elite as a scapegoat. And that elite is the internal opposition in combination with the EU. And this is what Alexis Tsipras, for example, is doing in Greece, who is a left-wing populist, who does the same. Now, his hold on Greece is much smaller than Orban's hold on Hungary, which is near absolute by now. But even in that situation, he will still say, well, I can't do this because I'm being frustrated by the EU, which works through the former Social Democrats, whoever. And this has a long tradition. Vladimir Mečiar, who was the prime minister in Slovakia in the 1990s, did exactly the same. And so it is not necessarily the case that once populists come to power, right, they die. On the other hand, it will be very hard for Orban to continue to do this, because at the moment, more and more people just see how powerful he is, and the conspiracy just becomes too ridiculous at a certain point in time. But you can do that for quite some time.
Okay, I know we want to have time to go out to the audience, so just one last one for John. John, how do you think political leaders should respond when populism begins to take root in their countries? I mean, how do we, we can't really ignore some of these issues that are out there. The rhetoric is unfortunately divisive. How do we manage that?
Okay, let me just say one thing about what Kas said. That my view is that in Greece, for instance, Syriza did fall into the situation where they were based upon a populist demand to end the austerity conditions that the EU had imposed. When they got into power and when they started negotiating, they discovered that they couldn't get it. Now they are in a position virtually of the PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic socialists that they displaced. They're like 5% now, and Syriza is the major left-wing party. And I think they're going to get knocked out of power because basically they are no longer a populist party. They're just they have become the substitute for the previous socialist party. So anyway, I think that there are dilemmas, and Podemos in Spain is having exactly the same problem. My feeling about the United States is that that there is a basic economic anxiety. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and we had a sense then, and I think I could speak for a large number of Americans, that there were jobs. We weren't going to, we weren't worried about the kinds of things that kids are worried about now, that the working class is worried about. Again, I think that in the wake of the Great Recession, this kind of anxiety has surfaced in both the Trump and the Sanders campaign. We've had cultural movements before, the Christian Coalition. We've had strictly racist movements also. That's not what's happening today. There is this socio-economic dimension to it. And I think that my hope is that Hillary Clinton, who I expect to be the next president, will start to respond to these things in a way that the Democrats, including her husband, did not respond, by buying into a lot of these, the promise of NAFTA, the promise of trade relationships with China. There were a lot of false promises involved there. So I think that my hope is that the leaders will begin to understand that there is a problem with unskilled and semi-skilled immigrants coming into the country and making it very difficult for African Americans, among others, and first-generation immigrants to get jobs, lowering wages. There is this big problem in the country about the 30% and the 70%, the 30% that's doing well and the 70% that's not doing well. Again, leave aside Trump's crazy rhetoric and all this stuff about, the stuff he says about women and Mexicans and all this. There is a basic thing that he's talking about when he's talking about runaway shops, immigration. There is an element of real issues there that I hope our political leaders pay attention to and don't dismiss.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just add one thing. Like this Peterson Institute for International Economics, this is what happens all the time. These are the people who said that NAFTA was going to bring in 170,000 jobs and create a trade surplus with Mexico. They're the people, again, who said the same thing about China in 2000. And now they have a report that says that if you do what Trump says, which, you know, nobody takes that much seriously, there's going to be a loss of 4.3 million jobs and a deep recession in 2019. You know, that might be true, though. I think they screw around with the numbers a little. But what we need is a more constructive response than that to what's going on in the economy. That's just dismissing it, and we're going to go back to the status quo.
Yeah, I thought it was put nicely in something I read recently, that in the basket of deplorables, there are a lot of decent but downcast people that have been left behind through some of this. So, all right, let's go out to the audience. There are microphones. If you could please raise your arm, make sure your question's a question, and speak into the microphone so our friends on live stream can see it. Yeah, why don't we start right there with Ann Wedner, please.
Thank you all so much for talking today. I had a question. I might think a little bit back on how the Republican right in our country has embraced religion before for a long time. And it strikes me that the Democrats fundamentally misunderstood the role of religion, and that basically it had to do with an emotional appeal about how things should be and how it makes you feel. And which, in a sense, while there seems like you guys are describing an economic reason for populism, the overwhelming takeaway of what we've seen in our country is an emotional reason for populism. And Hillary Clinton's particular failing is that she has no emotional connection and she's not able to understand the emotions of how people feel. So I wondered if you could talk about that. I would rename, after listening to you, I'd rename populism emotionalism.
You want to take that one, Sasha?
Yes. I mean, it's an interesting thing what happened in the Republican Party, because there were, 17 candidates at the beginning of the campaign, and Trump ended up being the nominee. And one distinguishing difference is that I think the other 16, to various extents, they all talk in terms of principles and ideology and some kind of framework that was coherent, however absurd it could be, or look someone like me. But they were talking in terms of principles. They're referring to the accepted axiomatic values that operate within the world of the Republican Party, family values, small government, whatnot. The one who won was the one who was completely incoherent. They did not make very few references to all those talking points. They've been reproduced. I've lived in this country 25 years. My first election was the '92 election. It's just the same vocabulary is being reproduced every year, over and over. There's something soothing about it, right? There's a continuity and the promise and the targets and all this. Trump's incoherence was his advantage in that, because he spoke directly to the people. Now, what people, that's a different story. And I would say that, we're talking about emotions. There are non-white emotions present in the political arena at any given time. And they do not exactly overlap, even the socioeconomic arena, with white working class or white middle class and so on. So even the emotional picture is far more complicated. The emotionalist talk, the fallacy of it is that somehow it's unmediated and unmitigated. It's just true because there's no artifice to it, right? But it's highly regulated, as humans' minds are, but also in the public arena and the sort of ideological context that a political party always is, right? It really is a representation of emotion. Right? So Trump has no substance in many ways. He sort of auditioned for a role that was open to 16 others, and he was the one who fit the role, because he could just reproduce, generate, and exploit this emotional state. And without really, to the extent that John is right, and he's right a lot, obviously, is that he didn't promise or outline any particular solutions to the situation, other than just speak back to this crowd, telling them, I understand your emotion, let's just get angry together. And this anger is transforming the whole field of political discourse. I mean, from the outside is outside the field of experts.
Yeah, Bill Singer, please, right there.
Bill Singer, boy, that's the best.
I don't think the mic's on.
Well, I was struck by the points that you make that result in sort of sui generis situations, Latin America being one kind, Southern Europe being another kind, Denmark, Sweden, and the Scandinavian countries being another. But the one that didn't get mentioned very much, and which for me was a really striking example, was the speech by George Osborne at the council, actually the small part because he didn't make it because of a plane, but he was late. But his point about Brexit, he was the former Chancellor of the Exchequer in England, was that he and Cameron had miscalculated. They had assumed that the socioeconomic factors would drive the vote. And he cited the example of a particular area in northern England, Sunderland, where everybody was working. Nissan was producing thousands and thousands of cars. People were very highly employed, and yet the vote was overwhelmingly in favor of Brexit in that particular area. And his conclusion was that the driver was nativism, was loss of their country. And they had miscalculated that. He frankly said that in his remarks. If you put aside the differences in Latin America and others, it seems to me that the closest proximity to the United States is England in terms of factors that apply. So I'd like anybody's comment about to what extent, how would you weigh the socioeconomic versus the nativism in the United States in terms of the rise of populism?
Cass, you mentioned nativism earlier. If you want to take that one.
Well, again, it's the combination. I mean, first of all, obviously that is what George Osborne is going to say, because he lost a terrible, terrible campaign. And the reason why the campaign was so much driven in the end by immigration was because they had no campaign. And so in the Brexit campaign, a lot came together. And it's now, Brexit has become synonymous for a radical right vote. But the Brexit vote was a very complex vote with a lot of different people voting on the basis of a lot of different reasons. One of the key reasons, and I think this is one of the key reasons why populism is successful today, was there was no clear ideological position to defend the status quo. Most of the arguments that Cameron made or that other people made were politics of fear. If you vote for Brexit, this and this is going to happen. Not, if we stay in the EU, we have this future. It's based on like this ideological reason. It was a fear campaign, as most of the campaigns for the European Union have been for years now. A lot of the arguments against Trump are fear. And this goes to John's point, right? They don't address more fundamental points that are underlying it. One of my biggest frustrations is, for example, the only candidate who has talked about one of the most devastating developments in US society today is Trump, drugs, right? Drugs are epidemic. There's a heroin epidemic, right? He mentions it. He has no ideas about it for the rest, but he mentions it. It's dismissed, but no one addresses those points. What people are looking for is an ideological, constructive reason why we should continue with what we have. And today, most politics is pragmatic. And in that pragmatic world, emotions, even not covered, backed up with content, become attractive. I do believe that if the mainstream would have had a more positive campaign, they would not have lost the referendum.
John, do you want to add something to that?
Well, I basically agree with it, and especially the complexity of the vote, because the UKIP, the party, really has two very different components. One, it starts off with the nostalgia about England, primarily upper middle class constituency, conservatives, and in the last, let's say, 10 years, it's spread to working class constituencies, many labor voters. And in the last 10 years is also when there's been a tremendous influx of immigration into Great Britain as a result of Great Britain agreeing. Blair had the chance, I think it was in 2005, to put off for 7 years the Schengen Agreement, whereby anybody could come into the country. He didn't, so within that period itself, that's when UKIP became much more of a mass movement and a mass phenomenon. And that laid the basis for, that laid the basis for the vote. And that was the anxiety, social, but also economic competition for lower wage jobs. Welfare, we're going to have to pay higher taxes. Don't forget that factor. Again, the importance in America, the importance in other countries. In Denmark, for instance, there is, the unemployment was like 7% at the height of the Great Recession. Now it's like 4%. But Denmark's a country that has a completely developed welfare state to the extent that we don't have at all. If you go on unemployment there, it's 4 years. For some people, the income is as high as 90% of what they were making. Now, if you have a society like that, it really depends on a sense of public trust, and that the people who are coming in it will abide by the same standards, will get the same kind of jobs. And when you get an influx even of a few thousand asylum seekers, that can spark a level of discontent, because these people are going to be seen as free riders. And that's both a social issue, terrorists, Muslims, but it's also an economic issue, undermining this basic welfare system that's based upon solidarity. So that's, again, and that applies to the Brexit thing.
Yeah, and we'll hear a lot more about Brexit later this morning. We have time for one more quick question before we move on. The mic's there.
Yes. I had a question sort of primarily for John, but happy to have anybody else respond. It has to do with labels to some extent. When Ralph Nader ran for president, I don't recall very many people talking about it as a populist at that time. And Bernie Sanders was running this year, and he talked about himself not so much as a populist, but as a democratic socialist. And polling seemed to indicate that a lot of Americans, quite surprisingly, and especially a lot of young people, were as excited about that democratic socialist label as perhaps some Trump people were excited about his right-wing populist label. So if you could address why wasn't Nader considered a populist, perhaps, and why wasn't Bernie taken at his word as a socialist?
Yeah, there is no scientific definition of any of these terms. The way they look, what I would say again about Bernie, I distinguish progressives, for instance, and liberals. The history of progressivism in America, going back to the early 20th century, is very connected to the idea of pluralism, finding a politics that accommodates all interests, but including the working class, labor and capital. That's the characteristic of liberalism. Socialism, working class versus the capitalist class, and you have a goal beyond that of socialism. Populism, again, is different from that. It is a demarcation of the people from the elite. It doesn't necessarily have a specific overall goal, such as like socialism has, and it's not a philosophy based upon pluralism, that you're going to accommodate the elite. You're going to quash them. You're going to make them agree to your terms. You're not going to find something that'll bring all the different parties together. Sanders' rigged economy, billionaire class, that's again the rhetoric of populism. I mean, Nader wasn't that important, so people didn't get worried about him until he's completely screwed up the election in November. But Sanders' rhetoric, I think, fits the history of American populism better than it does the history of either socialism or progressivism.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this panel, but there'll be lots more starting again at 10:30. Please join me in thanking Daniel, Cass, John, and Sasha.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated for our second panel and our moderator, Noah Tolley.
Thank you. I'm Noah Tolley, Senior Fellow for Global Cities here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I'm excited for our second session after an invigorating opening panel on the defining anxieties of this moment, the defining anxieties of this populist question. On the one hand, we have identified massive alienation, distrust, cynicism with regard to elites and institutions by some people who believe themselves to be among the populist movement. And on the other hand, we have anxieties about what democracy might mean if we empower that movement. To quote from British science fiction writer Adam Roberts' book, New Model Army, the problem is that real democracy has come back. And that's a problem because real democracy is a fire, a plague, a weed, a fever, a river, a storm. Real democracy is the opportunity for people to express the true nature of people as a mass. And that's, to clarify, not Adam Roberts' own position, but it is the position taken by his protagonist in the book. So you have a massive amount, I think, of anxiety on all sides of this conversation right now. Here on this panel, we're going to take a more granular look at populism in the US and Europe. You have the full biographies of our panelists on your seats, but they are Lee Feinstein, former ambassador to Poland, 2009 to 2012, and Dean of the Indiana University School of Global and International Studies. Dina Smeltz, our own Senior Fellow for Public Opinion and Foreign Policy here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Constanze Stetzenmüller, Robert Bosch Senior Fellow at Foreign Policy at the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings. And João Valle de Almeida, EU Ambassador to the UN and former EU Ambassador to the US. I'm going to open with a question for each of our panelists, and then we'll have more of a freewheeling discussion and kick it to the audience in the end. Perhaps we'll start with you, Constanze. Can you tell us a little bit about the political situation in Germany specifically, which remains in many ways the core of the EU politically and economically, but has seen a new party, the Alternative for Germany, or the AfD, rise to prominence? What is the AfD and what do they want? And how does the AfD fit under the rubric of populism?
Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Ivo and his colleagues of the Chicago Council for this invitation. I think this topic, sadly, couldn't be more timely. And I'm one of the many Europeans living in Washington, following obsessively polls and news and quotes and a certain hotel owner's Twitter feed. So yes, there are many reasons to talk about this, but including, of course, populism in my own country. The AfD was founded in February 2013 as an anti-Euro party in the wake of the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis, which, of course, in some ways is still affecting Europe and was at that time worrying a lot of Germans. It's since been transformed into an aggressively anti-immigrant, anti-Islamist, in some ways anti-Semitic party and movement. It has fielded candidates in 10 out of 11 regional state elections, 11 of 16 states in Germany, that have been held since 2013. And in 9 out of those 10, it easily vaulted over the 5% threshold to get into state legislatures. 5 of those were in the old East Germany, 5 in the West. And since the onset of the refugee crisis, the AfD has achieved double-digit votes in the elections that it's participated in since then. The most startling of those was in early September in Angela Merkel's home state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where it pushed the CDU, her own party, into 3rd place for the first time since its creation, where it attracted, I think, increased the voter turnout by 10%, It got 20.8%, which was not its highest value. It had gotten 24% in another state a couple months earlier. But it attracted voters from all the established parties. So this is really, this September vote really got people's attention, as you would imagine. Now, as to its roots, as I said, it started out by appealing to people's fears of the euro and fears of the German economy, which of course has been really almost the only one that has survived the euro crisis mostly intact and doing well. But of course, Germans being generally our temperament is to worry about things even if we have no reason to, and so people are worried about that. But by now, of course, it's attracting everybody who is unhappy about something. And this is not, as the first panel was discussing, not just people who have or might have reason to worry about their economic state, their own prosperity or that of their children and grandchildren, but it's about people who worry about the nation state losing control, who worry about losing identity, who worry about strangers, or who just in general think that things aren't going the way they want them to. Now, in public, the AfD has sort of presented a shambolic appearance. There's been a lot of leadership infighting. There's been shifts in leadership. Frauke Petry, the current leader, has lost popularity points. She's at the bottom end of a poll that's done every month by one of the TV networks at 11% popularity. That's not great. But beneath that shambolic appearance is a very, very deliberate attempt to create alliances within Germany, both by reaching out to the conservative side of Angela Merkel's own Christian Democrats, who are center-right, by reaching out to populist movements across Europe, and by reaching out to the German extreme left, the Die Linke party. So far, again, that hasn't been particularly successful, but you can see that if you look at the polls, you can see a predisposition there that I think rightly makes one worried with regard to our next federal elections, which are in, they haven't been determined yet, and Merkel hasn't said yet whether she's running, although I would expect her to, but those will probably be in late September 2017. So, and the other thing, of course, that I want to mention here before I stop is that this is a situation where the AfD, if it's done one thing on the national level, it's pushed the representative establishment parties on the defensive. It has managed to set the agenda, or at least to shape the agenda. And of course, it's being that atmosphere, that mood is being used by Russian propaganda. And the one thing that we all, I think, expect and can expect is that Germany will become a battleground within the coming year, and up until the elections and afterwards, for attempts to turn the public mood. So I, as a German, and many of my other fellow Europeans are watching what's happening here with the expectation that something very similar will be happening in our country very shortly. In fact, in many ways, it's already begun.
Let me follow up on that. You mentioned that the AfD has pushed Angela Merkel's party, the CDU, out of second place even in her own home state. And some have argued that the success of the AfD is really predicated on the failure of Merkel and the CDU. What do you think about that?
You know, I honestly think that that's a slightly unfair criticism. Angela Merkel took over a CDU that in some ways, if you'll forgive my being rude here, in some ways was a little bit like the Republican Party today. In other words, there were signs of fatigue. And it had been run by old white men for a very long time. It had paid no attention to the changes in German society, to the ascension of people with migrant backgrounds in the political camps, to the fact that a lot of CDU parliamentarians were gay, that a lot of people felt that gay marriage, ought to be okay even for conservatives, etc. In other words, the CDU voter base had modernized considerably, but the CDU party hierarchy had not. And so what Angela Merkel did was basically what Bill Clinton did in the 1990s, which is that she triangulated the CDU into the middle, thereby squeezing out, in particular, her social democratic coalition partner, which has been struggling ever since in this position, but leaving, and this is crucial for Germans and for German post-war party political history, leaving the extreme right wing of the party uncovered. Now, it's been practically a biblical tenet for CDU leaders ever since 1945 that to keep that part of the spectrum covered. And it has essentially found itself homeless, and that's where the AfD has been feeding. As I said, it's not just been feeding there, it's been feeding across the party establishment. And in reality, in my country, as in I think all others, including yours, the battle lines now are between people who want an open society, who feel that that we profit from globalization, and of course no other country has profited like Germany from globalization in Europe. It's essential for our national well-being and our prosperity, and those who want to pull up the drawbridges and who want to have a more identitarian sense of nationhood.
Thank you.
So,
Ambassador Almeida, you get the first Brexit question of the panel. You represent the EU at the UN, and you were previously EU ambassador to the US. And Brexit must be the issue that's top of mind right now for you and others who are doing similar work. It's the most significant electoral success of the populist movement. What does Brexit mean for the EU and all that the EU stands for? Open borders across the bloc, a single market, freedom of movement. Is that project in peril? And are open and integrated economies in peril?
Thank you, Noah. A very, very good question. I'm an active diplomat, and I intend to remain so for a number of years. So I have to say from the very start that my opinions are personal here. But I accepted Ivo's invitation because I think this is one of the most crucial themes that one should discuss today, both in the US and in Europe. And I speak for Europe particularly. This is maybe the last big battle of my generation. And I would like to share with you some of our concerns, but also learn from you, and I've learned a lot in the first panel. But I have to stay at the level of personal comments here. Why is this so important? Populism in general, I'll come back to the Brexit question. Why is this so important for my generation? I was born in 1957, which happens to be the year of the Treaty of Rome, which basically launched the European Union. And I graduated from high school in 1974, when my country, Portugal, returned to democracy after 50 years of dictatorship. So I'm sort of bound by these two dates and these two events or coincidences that have shaped, to a large extent, my generation. And what we did in Europe, this generation, was to build on the foundations of my parents and my grandparents, and Constance's respective ones, that brought Europe out of two Cold Wars, two civil wars, world wars, but also out of the Cold War. And we feel today that this could be threatened. And we feel that we should fight back. We should try to understand, which is basically what we're doing here this morning, but we should also fight back. Because I want to convey and relay to my almost 2-year-old granddaughter the legacy that was given to me, enhanced and improved as I think we did the last few generations. So this is critically important to understand and to see how we can move ahead. Europe is a fertile ground for populism, for reasons that I think you all understand. We have a difficult construction of shared sovereignty, which is part of our success, which is the secret of our success since the end of the Second World War. And we were able to, out of 6 founding countries, move to 28 countries, so more than 500 million people living in democracy, in relative prosperity, in peace, in democracy. This is a fundamental achievement. But this was done on the construction of shared sovereignty, or transferred sovereignty, whatever you want to put it. But this construction is fragile and liable to exploitation by populists. One of the factors that populists use is the gap, the divorce, the distance between citizens and politicians, and those who take decisions on their behalf. Well, if you take Europe, that remoteness is even bigger than at the national level, because basically most of the decisions are taken in Brussels or Strasbourg by people who represent, in a democratic, legitimate way, the citizens. But the perception is one of remoteness. So what you have already at a state level, like a country in the US, and I travel around your country in my almost 5 years as ambassador to the US, and I know what people think about Washington and how far they think they are and they believe they are from Washington. So put that in a European perspective, where you have guys with strange accents like mine taking decisions on behalf of 500 million people. They are fully empowered to do so because the mechanisms are there. But the perception, and I go back to some of the issues of the previous panel, is a very difficult one. Also on the issues of solidarity. There's a lot of solidarity going on within Europe, but you don't see it, you don't recognize it. You know, we're talking about Greece, we could talk about Portugal. You know, our countries were on the brink of bankruptcy, literally on the brink of bankruptcy. We needed money, we needed support, we needed help. That help, that money, that support came from other European countries. You ask Portuguese voters, you ask Greek voters, do they realize that there was a dimension of solidarity in here? No, the prevailing feeling is that Brussels imposed austerity on them. Brussels, who are these guys who are taking decisions on my behalf? So the European construction, which has been extremely successful, incorporates elements of vulnerability that are being exploited by populists. And this is why the issue is so critical in Europe. About Brexit. First of all, I have an enormous respect for the decision taken by the British voters. Democratic process, fully legitimate. Nothing to say about that. I have slightly less respect for the way we got there, because I think the debate did not reveal the highest quality. You see, I want to remain in my function for a few years. And I think it was an illustration of the risks. First, the risks of referendum in general, and we've seen other cases. Secondly, the risk of a particular decision being taken over or hijacked by a relatively easy discourse. You know, I found myself in the plane coming over from New York last night thinking about, a formulation that somehow, encapsulates what happens there. I mean, the guys who wanted to leave, those who wanted to leave the European Union, were basically saying, let's change for the better. On the other side, we couldn't say much more than it's better not to change. So see the difference between the power of change for the better and the weakness of we better not change. And this somehow encapsulates a little bit the dilemma and the challenge that we have in fighting populism in this kind of context. So that's why Brexit is important, certainly, but also interesting from a sociological, political science point of view, to try to go deeper into this phenomenon. Now, on your particular question, is this a danger for the European Union? I don't think so. Some people talk about the perfect storm hitting Europe. The ring of fire around us, migration, terrorism, the consequences of the financial crisis, which are still there, although I agree with some of the points made that socio-economic factors are not the only ones, and maybe not the most important ones, to explain populism. But still, it's almost a perfect storm. It's not yet the perfect storm. I think, like in the past, the European Union is capable of overcoming this situation. So what kind of Europe we will have in 5 years' time, once we have negotiated the conditions for the British withdrawal. I think we'll still be there. I think we'll still be a success story, but we may be a different one. Let's see.
Thank you. Ambassador Feinstein, you served as ambassador to Poland and have broad experience in Central and Eastern Europe. I wonder if you can speak to Central and Eastern Europe more broadly. What does populism look like there? Has it taken root? And what have been the conditions there in which it has actually moved forward?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Ivo, for the invitation, and congratulations to you and your colleagues on this spectacular place. And thank you also for allowing a lifelong Mets fan into your midst at this season. I appreciate that. Well, I'm just back from Berlin and Warsaw literally last night. And I was very impressed to hear the first two comments because they both went to historical and cultural circumstances. And I think really that's where your question goes, because the historical, cultural, societal circumstances of each of the states in Europe, as well as in our discussion earlier that encompass the United States, and even the geographies have a big impact on how these things are perceived. And in Central and Eastern Europe, these issues are perceived really in a very unique way, I would say. So, for example, in some parts of Europe, criticism of the EU and a tepid feeling about membership in the EU is a component of this populist impulse. But in Central Europe, it's more complicated than that. And you'll find actually the highest percentage of people in the EU supportive of EU membership. So it's really not a component of this wave that people are describing. Now, it's complicated, and we can talk about why that is. A lot of it has to do with, prosaic issues like cohesion funds, transfers of money from Brussels to different capitals. But also it has to do with the sort of historical circumstances of some of these countries, which want more than anything else to be part of the West, part of Western institutions, both for the security benefits that they see and also as a matter of national identity. So here is an instance in which national identity in its own way also corresponds to a European identity, even though there are these cross-cutting issues. The second thing I would say is that the issues don't line up left and right, which is a characteristic we've been talking about in both panels, but they're particularly unusual, or not unusual, but they're different in the part of the world we're talking about now. So you can have this criticism of a corrupt elite side by side with an environmentalism, side by side with an intense anti-Russian feeling, and together with an opposition to flu vaccines. And these are all things that can go together. And I think an interesting point to keep in mind is that those are views that actually, in many cases in this part of the world, transcend political points of view. So people who might be center or center-right and maybe more to the right share these kinds of views. And I know we're going to be talking about a much more important and thorough poll by the Chicago Council, but I was just taking part in a discussion with the Pew Research Center on European attitudes towards immigration. And one of the things is, while in certain parts of Europe, the attitudes correspond to what political points of view are. People who have favorable views to far-right or populist parties tend to have more negative views, for example, towards Muslims. In Central and Eastern Europe, the political positioning, as people self-identify, is much less significant. So, for example, concerns that migration, in particular Muslim migration, would have a negative impact on the economy and economic security, those cross the political spectrum in this part of the world. And the same is true about the potential impact of Muslim immigration on national security and terrorism. And by the way, much more so, they're much more widespread views than even in a place like France, where obviously France has experienced this directly. And so, and the other point here is that this is really a theoretical concern, because in this part of the world, there's been close to zero immigration from the Muslim world. So I guess the basic point I wanted to make here is that it's distinctive, and it takes very distinctive forms in different parts of Europe, and in particular in this part of Europe, and that the historical, societal, cultural, and even geographic circumstances of the places really tend to define it. And sort of trying to understand and evaluate it really requires looking at it from these specific perspectives.
So the specific perspectives and context matter quite a bit. Dina, let's take a closer look at the U.S., a very different context. What issues have been most important to voters this year, according to the results of the 2016 Chicago Council survey? And how do these map onto the conversation about populism? Can they explain why voters turned out in such large numbers for Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, for example, when those two were considered the unlikeliest of candidates to start out?
Right, yeah, sure. So generally in American elections, the economy and jobs are the top concern, and that's no different in this election. But also foreign policy issues are high up on voters' minds too this year, specifically because of the terrorist attacks that we've had at San Bernardino and Orlando and recently in New York, and also across Europe and in Turkey as well. So it's interesting because the terrorism angle really doesn't differentiate any of the candidates for voters. The economic angle, important for all candidates, and we asked about primary candidates and who people's top choice was. So for the core Trump supporter in particular, there was an anti-globalization, anti-trade sentiment, but even stronger is an anti-immigration sentiment, which goes, I think, to some of the issues that you were talking about, Lee, about national identity, what it means to be an American, and a reaction to the demographic transitions that are happening in our country and across all the countries we're talking about. So for the Trump supporter, immigration, any core Trump supporter was more unfavorable toward immigration on each and every question that we asked. A majority support deporting undocumented immigrants that are currently working in the United States, 60% compared to 40% of Americans overall. 92% of Trump supporters support building a wall, expanding our wall with Mexico, compared to just 49% of average Americans. So across the board, they were the most unfavorable toward various immigrant groups. So that combined with a negative view toward globalization, only about half of Trump supporters say that globalization is mostly good for the United States and U.S. economy, versus 65% of Americans overall. So those were the two differentiating factors for them. For the Bernie supporters, in our data, really the only thing that they stood out on was feeling that the next generation of Americans won't do as well as adults today. But the Trump supporters were even more concerned and more negative about the prospects of the next generation. And then I think what combines in the support of both Bernie and Donald Trump supporters is the idea that the system is rigged, that politicians are far removed from average people, and that kind of along the lines of what Elizabeth Warren has argued, that the government and business are stacking the deck, are in cahoots against the average American, and so the average American doesn't have a chance. So I think that's where you see some combinations. And it reminds me, the last panel, people brought up the Tea Party, which was one element of populism before. Also, the Occupy movement in 2008 was another example, and an anti-globalization protest just like the ones in the 90s. And people were comparing the Occupy movement with the Tea Party movement and saying there's actually some similarities there. And I think there's some of the same similarities that we see among the Bernie and Trump supporters today.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Council on Global Affairs has been collecting public opinion data since the 1970s and analyzing it. If we have that historical data, we should be able to see whether the sentiments about globalization, immigration are new. So are these new, or what can we see with regard to the historical development? If they're not new, why are we seeing such activism around them right now for the first time?
So they are, yes and no. They're new. I have some of these fold-outs on table 2 right in front of me, and I think there's some here to pass out at the end if people want them. But there is some long-term graphs, I don't know if you can see, on globalization. And still, Americans, regardless of your political affiliation, Americans support globalization. But since 2008, and maybe that's because of the financial crisis, maybe it's because Barack Obama became president, but since 2008, people who support the Republican Party or define themselves as Republican Party supporters have become less positive toward globalization. This also coincides with the demographic shifts within the Republican Party, so that white, non-college educated individuals are now in a greater proportion represented in the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party in the past. So these might be people who used to be labor union, people who belong to a labor union and worked for maybe a factory or in a mine, and who lost their job perhaps, and they don't see, and they have a pension and are doing quite well, but they don't see the next generation having those same opportunities. Mm-hmm. So, and then on immigration, since between 1998 and 2002, similar percentages of Republicans and Democrats saw immigration as a threat. But since 2002, Republicans have steadily declined, so that now today 67% of Republicans say that immigration is a critical threat to the United States. It's the highest it's ever been. And only 27% of Democrats see immigration as a critical threat to the United States. So that's a 40 percentage point gap, which is a historic high. So on immigration, we see generally among the public, this is becoming an ever more polarized issue.
So I have a question for everyone. One of our goals is to actually understand populism and its voters' concerns. So not just to say, populism is this, but we can't access it. We're so alienated from it, we don't really get it, and that's impossible. So let's give that a shot here. We've heard about breakdowns of vulnerability and solidarity. We've heard that, perhaps from Dina just now, that the system, according to some, is rigged. We've heard that from the last panel, that there's a breakdown of the social contract of liberalism. In general, populism is characterized by alienation from, distrust of, cynicism toward elites and institutions. And it's also characterized by a deep sense of disadvantage coming from the mechanisms of liberalism. But what do you consider to be the most important among these factors? If we're trying to understand the populist movements we see today, what are the very most important of these factors?
Well, maybe just a contribution. I think, first of all, the concept of populism, as we've seen in the first panel, is not a stable one, let alone a scientific one. We're talking about different realities in different countries, different motivations that lead to what we call populism. But it's a moving target in a way, and something that still needs further work to conceptualize fully. The first point. Second one, we cannot isolate populism from the rest of the political landscape. This is a dialectic kind of dynamic relationship between those who have a certain number of views, or lack of, and those who pretend to have another vision for the society. And it's very much about the interaction between the two. So as much as we need to concentrate on populism, what it is, what their ideas are, or what their, what's the underlying dimension of populism, we also need to talk about the other side and see to what extent those who have different views are being active enough, speaking up enough, articulating enough an alternative narrative to what the populists are proclaiming to support. And this is an issue that I think we should also discuss as long as we discuss populism. And there, again, speaking about Europe, not about the US, I think there's ground for a debate about how far and how well have those who have different views from populists articulated an alternative view. And how much have we been able to stand for what we have been doing in Europe, for instance? Did our political elites, and I'm talking about a large scope of political forces that go from center left to center right, Christian Democrats, liberals, and social democrats. These are the three political families that built Europe after the Second World War. And all of us who have no direct party affiliation but are part of this movement that created and supports Europe. And I think there's a dimension of self-criticism, and I'm talking about a citizen here, and we should question ourselves. Have we done enough? Are we doing enough to propose a solid narrative for our people? When I had central responsibilities in Brussels a few years ago, we lost two referendums in France and the Netherlands in 2005. We had a sort of European constitution that was defeated in France and the Netherlands. And this was a major event in Europe. It somehow stopped the sort of progress towards further integration. And it led to some reflection about what was going on. And one image that I like is, which is again self-critical, we realized, when maybe it's still valid today, that European politicians, they sort of criticize Europe for all the sins from Monday to Friday, and then they ask for people to vote for Europe either on Thursday or Saturday or Sunday. People are supposed to vote. This is not sustainable. And because this opens the ground for populists to step in and basically question the whole construction. So I think as much as populism needs to be analyzed, we also should not forget the other side of the argument and how much more maybe we could do, again, I'm talking about Europe, to fight back the populist proposals with solid and articulate narratives on our side.
I want to come back to that, but I want to give the other panelists a chance to respond too. Constanza, I could tell you had something to say a minute ago.
Well, I was thinking, listening to João, about my own perspective. I'm a foreign service brat. I'm an insider, outsider in my own country, and my parents were children during the war. My dad was drafted as a 16-year-old in the last year of the war and counted himself very lucky to become an American POW at 17, barely. And I've been a journalist and somebody who traveled through war zones, post-war zones. I've written about war crimes and war crimes tribunals. So to me, the experience of war in Europe is both a transmitted experience through that of my parents, but it's also my own personal experience. So I have no problem with the narrative, the foundational narrative of Europe as avoiding war, the never again narrative. It's deeply personal to me, and it's deeply personal, I think, to any German of my generation. It's a little more difficult to explain that to millennials, I admit that. Yeah. But for me, not a problem. And I'm also a lawyer by training, constitutional and human rights lawyer. And so I think about the problem of preserving what we achieved in Europe in engineering terms, if you will, as lawyers do. And to me, this is a three-part problem. It's about preserving representative democracy, political pluralism and the protection of minorities on one level. On the next level, protecting market democracy. And on the final level, preserving decent and somewhat fair social contracts. That is also the foundational ideology, if you will, or the foundational idea of my own country, at least of the West German part of it. And I think I sense in Berlin, and Lee, you were just telling me about your trip to Berlin now. I go there quite regularly from Washington, where I now live. And I sense in Berlin, among policymakers, some of whom are my age, a willingness to fight for this. This is time to be stand up and be counted mood. And again, because I think that in Germany you have a special commitment and a special historical memory and a special commitment to the rest of Europe, where the Nazis committed some of their worst war crimes. But what's slightly complicating this problem right now is that we're suddenly finding ourselves by default the leaders of Europe because of Brexit and because the French are in this inward moment and because there are cultural wars in Poland and in Hungary and other places, which, if you will, also have a slightly different historical experience and are coming at some experiences slightly later than the Western Europeans, and who are going through their own long-term pains of democratic transformation and modernization, which I think one has to respect. But it's, and then you add to that the increasing conflicts, mounting tensions around Europe, both in Eastern Europe, in that case stoked by Russia, and in Northern Africa and the Middle East, also to some degree stoked by Russia and by others. And trying to keep a grip on all this, stabilizing it, continuing the transformation, saving the European project under these circumstances is not something, as one country can do on its own, as well-intentioned as it might be and as conscious of its responsibility as it might be. Now, I'm the last person not to admit that the Germans have made all sorts of mistakes, and have sort of alienated some of their neighbors in one way or another. I can go into great depth on this, but the reality is that this is something that we can only save as all of us, and we can use all the help we can get. So your election really matters to us now. We'd like you to get this right. And it matters also because I think the transatlantic space has become more integrated politically and economically and socially than ever before, as I think America realized in the context of the economic crisis. But this continues to be the case. And so we have a stake in each other's domestic affairs in a way that I don't think we have ever experienced before. I think this is truly new to those of us who work on the foreign and security policy side of this, is that now suddenly it is crucial to us to get the domestic, democratic aspect of this right. I'm not going to stop there.
I'll just add, you had asked before too, what is new about this election season or this year that we're seeing all these forces come together. And actually, in one way, it's because we have candidates who are willing to blend all these fears about terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism and immigration together. But in many ways, we really shouldn't be surprised at all because for at least a decade, these differences have been growing, these objections to immigration and trade and globalization. But also in our data, even way back in 2002, we do surveys of elites, which are business leaders and government leaders and members of the media and labor union leaders and NGOs. So we have a leader sample and a public opinion sample that we can compare. And for decades now, for average Americans, jobs is the #1 priority, and it's really fairly low among the leaders. And same for just average Republicans, immigration has been an issue for decades, and for Republican leadership, it's been very low on the agenda. So when looking back at all the data, we really shouldn't be surprised because these have been brewing. And we've seen episodic, protests against globalization and different kinds of movements before, and also on the right for the Tea Party, for example. So you had asked if this is something new. No, but we really need to be concerned about how to address it and try to close these gaps between the elite and the public.
I want to build off those three responses to give Ambassador Feinstein one last question before we turn it to the audience. Those three responses got us into the territory of what should political leaders do, how should political leaders respond when populism begins to take root. That was one of the questions asked on the last panel as well. And we've heard that they should, in fact, I think I hear from Dina, they should hear this earlier, right? They should see this gap growing earlier. We could have seen it in 2002. From Ambassador Almeida, that political leaders need to make the case for what they're doing, not just the case against what someone else is pitching, what populist movements are pitching. And we've heard as well from Constanza that there needs to be attention to preserving the institutions that safeguard the social contracts of liberalism. But I wonder whether it's possible or how easy it is to identify the legitimate concerns, too, of populism and disentangle them from ugly sentiments and political instabilities, and then address them through those institutions. And we'll start with Ambassador Feinstein, but I can tell as well that Constanza, you have something to say, and also Ambassador Almeida. So we'll throw it open to everybody.
Well, just briefly, it's hard enough to answer that question in the context of one country, but to answer that question in the context of the EU, I think is even more difficult for all the reasons that Constanza said, and because the pros and cons of the European project are different for different EU members. I mean, not all EU members, but there are very strong differences, with respect to the U.S. context, I mean, I think our first panel talked about this pretty well, but I'm actually a newbie into the Midwest, but somehow the Midwest has somehow become ground zero for this election and the kinds of concerns that people in the Midwest are experiencing. I'm living now in South Central Indiana, something I didn't expect to say in my lifetime, but we like it there. But we're struck by, once you leave the bubble of Bloomington, how difficult the circumstances are for folks. And I know that this is something that's familiar to this audience as well, but the drug addiction, meth labs, life expectancy, public health more generally, these are really serious concerns that need to be addressed. The affordability of education and childcare are very fundamental issues. And obviously, and this I think is an issue that crosses the Atlantic very clearly, the ability to benefit more equally, or to have the benefits spread more widely to different types of people. In my neck of the woods in Europe, the issues are that the benefits of EU membership are not felt the same, even in the same country. So, for example, Eastern Poland and Northwestern Poland, there's a sense that the benefits of EU membership have not redounded to the benefit of people whose life experiences and circumstances are quite different from people, say, in the big cities. So that I think is the project for political leaders. I did want to just comment on something that Constanza said, which I think is extremely important, which I felt in a way that I hadn't experienced before, just having come back, which is how important is the transatlantic connection to these trends that we're seeing, and how, it's one thing to say that we're all experiencing the same global phenomenon, but also what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic impact one another. And that I think is quite important and interesting. And Constanza is talking about how she's following the election very closely here and hope, I know this is a nonpartisan setting, but alas, hope that the election comes out the right way.
I didn't say which way.
Nor did I. And one of the things, but one of the things I heard a lot and I think is worth thinking about a lot is what the impact could be of a certain outcome in the United States, and whether that would dampen what we're describing, loosely speaking, as populist pressures in Europe, whether it would slow the momentum down, whether it might give some confidence to those who are trying to oppose these forces, and what the opposite result and what impact that could have. And then just finally, just to say, and it's a slightly separate subject, and Ivo and I were talking about it before, and Ivo's back from Asia and says it's even exponentially more keenly felt there. The concern in Europe about the degree to which the United States is paying attention to what's happening in Europe, cares about the transatlantic relationship, to say nothing of the Article 5 NATO commitment and all of the stuff that's come up. This is really being felt quite acutely in Europe, and I think it's a serious problem, obviously, on its own. I guess if in the silver lining search, I think the good news is that on both sides of the Atlantic, people are taking this and the burden sharing questions, I think, more seriously than previously. That's also reinforced by the actions of Mr. Putin, which I think would also be doing that all on their own. But this also contributes to the dynamic that we're talking about, and the sense that maybe institutions aren't working. And so I think I just wanted to comment on what Constanze said, and the fact that this transatlantic connection now is not, we're not only being acted upon, but what happens in on each side of the Atlantic is having an impact on the other.
So I was conscious that I didn't really answer your question, but you brought it back with the question about disentangling the good reasons from the bad. And I'm going to take a stab at sort of turning this back to America, despite the fact that I'm a European, and say that having been living in this country for at interim periods for much of my life, I was at graduate school here in the late 80s, the Reagan Revolution, etc., the transition to Bush. And it seems to me, if I may be so impolite, that in this country, the pendulum has swung slightly too far out in terms of the delegitimization of the state as a provider of public goods and as an arbiter of the fair distribution of public goods. I understand why the Reagan Revolution happened. I consider myself a liberal in many things, but I think that the state of America's roads, railways, and schools, to name only a couple of points, I think is some evidence for the fact that markets and society can't always pick this up. Now, I'm really not, I'm not your classic European super statist, but I do think that it's gone too far here and that America is paying the price for that somewhat. I also think that you and we both are paying the price for not paying enough attention to questions of inequality and of long-term structural changes in the labor market, which produce pockets of inequality and political alienation that in themselves become festering sores that representative democratic elites have failed to pay enough attention to. Now let me return to my own country. I think that some people have asked whether the AfD is an East German phenomenon. I think the answer is yes, but only partially. The East German part of this is real, and I think it's resentment at West German carpetbagging after reunification. That is not a fashionable thing to say in Germany. But I remember that some of the worst, my worst classmates in law school all became judges in East Germany or joined the Treuhand, which was responsible for privatizing East German government assets. Of course, all of the East German economy was owned by the government, so all of it had to be privatized, and a lot of it was non-viable. But I remember as a young journalist, as an intern at a Berlin daily paper, going to one hunger strike after the other in East German factories and seeing these people who really did not know what their future was going to look like and blaming West Germany for this. I mean, their factories weren't viable. They were sometimes, they looked like Second World War ruins, and some of them looked like something out of the 19th century. It was very clear that there was something, that modernization was going to be necessary. And in fact, many parts of East Germany have modernized dramatically and impressively. But are there pockets there? Yes, there are pockets of alienation. And and there are also, sometimes these are the children of the functional, or the grandchildren of the functional elites of East Germany, who didn't make the jump. For many East Germans, this was liberation, and they ran with it, and they traveled abroad, etc. But for the children of the Stasi, the children of the East German military and their grandchildren, this was the end of legitimacy, the end of social status, and the end of prosperity. And guess what? Some of the terrorists, the right-wing terrorists, come exactly from those milieus. Again, it's not just an East German phenomenon. We have similar things. We have economic and social alienation in West Germany. And I think to the extent that this is a wake-up call to all of us to pay attention to the health of our social contracts, the labor market, and the promise of representative democracy, I think this is a damn good thing. And if it puts an end to complacency of the great and the good, I think it's a damn good thing as well. And that goes certainly for my country, but I think it goes for others too.
Just a few points. I agree almost entirely with what Constance just said. But on fighting populism, I think that the first step is to acknowledge that we have an issue. As you say here, we have a situation. And we have to acknowledge it. Ignoring it is the worst thing to do. Secondly, we need to fight back with a positive, appealing narrative to how do we want the world to be. And thirdly, we need to avoid two things, I would say. One is to copy populism. A copy is never better than its original. So if you copy them, people will choose the original. So you are only reinforcing the original. So you are playing into the hands of populists. Copying their agenda is one thing to avoid. And the other one is to be complacent and to ignore that behind populism there are some real issues, some serious issues that need to be addressed. And some were mentioned in the previous panel, and some were mentioned by us here. So I think this is the methodology. Acknowledge, fight back, and articulate a response which avoids these two pitfalls. Second point I would like to make is about transatlantic, my previous responsibilities here. I contributed to an interesting project which is called TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Well, it doesn't look good today. It does look good in an election in one side of the Atlantic, but there's not a single candidate in favor of free trade, at least openly and positively in favor of free trade. This is worrying. It's worrying on the other side of the Atlantic, where you have the opponents much more vocal than the proponents. And basically, let's be frank, we are losing the public opinion battle around free trade in Europe. We have an issue with the Canadian agreement, but the TTIP one, and this is critical to our economic survival in today's world. If these two blocks, which are still the most important economic blocks in the world, but not for too long, if they cannot agree on a common approach to the further stages of globalization, will be in the hands of those who may not necessarily share our fundamental values and our fundamental interest in the way we organize the world. But we need to understand why people are reacting this way to this prospect, although, and one should not be naive, there are many other third actors, third partners interested in having us divided, and certainly supporting some of the views that put in question TTIP in this particular case. But that would take us very, very far. And my last point is one of hope. Constance mentioned the millennials. I have 2 millennial sons, and when I talk to them about peace in Europe, they look at me like, what is he talking about? But when I tell them that, listen, if this trend goes on, I mean, you'll be stopped at every border, You will not be able to go to another university. Your diplomas will not be recognized. You will pay roaming again. The low-cost traveling is over because of conflicting regulation, and so much and so forth. So and then they try to understand that what they've got today is not necessarily taken for granted. And I think also what I've seen in opinion polls after Brexit in Europe, in some countries, which is a positive reaction in favor of Europe out of the possible reality of countries leaving, all of this makes me feel hopeful that our youth will be able to carry on this and they will fight back this threat of populism, but we have to help them.
Great, thank you. Dina?
Yeah, just a quick point. So it's interesting, in the United States there is conventional wisdom that Americans too are critical of trade agreements, but actually we find consistently that 2/3 support the TPP and TTIP when we last asked in 2015. So it's actually the politicians that sabotage it more than public opinion, which is often held to blame. But I just wanted to quickly underscore Constanza's point about economic dislocation and the effect that the digital revolution has had on the way people work and the jobs we have, and maybe it has moved so quickly that we don't seem to have a strategy for how to deal with people who lose their jobs because of it. And I think that's going to be very important for the next administration and administrations to come.
And we'll need, as Ambassador Almeida pointed out, a hopeful response to those kinds of challenges. All right, let's turn it to the audience. I bet you have a number of great questions for our panelists, and we'll start right here in the front.
Thank you. The panel spoke very eloquently about the need to make a stronger affirmative case for European institutions, but to some extent one has the sense that this is driven much more by identity politics, by a visceral sense of who one is and to what society one belongs, than a kind of cerebral loyalty to a specific set of constitutional arrangements. Yeah. What can European institutions do to promote a real sense of European identity?
Why don't you go ahead?
All right. Okay. All right. I was thinking actually that we hadn't addressed that part enough. So thank you for raising that question. It's very helpful. I come from a country, obviously, that's particularly neurotic about identity. Yeah. When I was little, Germans were Catholic or Protestant, and they were definitely white. Now my own family has, I think my extended family has 3 Afro-hyphenated Germans, Swiss, Americans, a Jewish American, a Taiwanese, in other words, social change has happened even in Germany. Mostly it's been through labor migration, a lot also through refugees. Usually those movements, though, the labor migrants were expected to come back, to go back to their own country for the longest time. And the refugees were, from all over the world, and the groups themselves were so small that they didn't really have a massive impact. Then it turned out in the 70s and 80s that guess what, the labor migrants were there to stay, and the biggest group there was the Turks, who were Sunni Muslims, mostly very secular. But we made no effort whatsoever to integrate them, because we thought, they're going home again. We'll stay white and German and all that. And then, of course, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we got another massive wave of immigration. That's not that well known in this country, but we got, I think, 100,000 Soviet Jews, many of whom were pretty secular as well. And a lot of ethnic Germans from Russia, whose families had been immigrated or called there, lured there with promise of prosperity in the 18th century. And as a result, my country's its face has completely changed now. We also have one distinct advantage with compared to other Europeans, which is that we lost our colonies in 1919. So we don't have significant populations that have massive colonial hang-ups from ugly and bloody decolonization wars, unlike the French and the English, where that really makes a difference. And these people got British or French passports, but nothing else. In other words, they got the promise of citizenship, but nothing else. And there you have an alienation that's just waiting to be switched on. Yeah? And as it happens, it's been switched on by Islamic fundamentalism. That's happened in my country too, but to a much lesser extent. I mean, it's definitely there, and as we know, a small, a little is enough in these cases. But the reality is that the Germans woke up about 10 years ago to the need to actually make a greater push for integration. That before had been politically incorrect, because of course, how could we force anyone to be a German, right? But at this point, that's well over, and we now have significant government, regional, municipal programs to help achieve that. And the promise is, it will be easier for you to get a passport, but you are going to have to make a bigger effort to integrate. You are going to have to toe the line on certain German constitutional values, such as the equal treatment of women, et cetera, et cetera. And the challenge here, of course, is that we've had a sort of very distinctly negative approach to freedom of religion. In other words, it's private. People get to do in their own space what they want to do. So we have not had a burqa ban like the French, but we have said women wearing headscarves can't become teachers in government schools. It's sort of it's a tricky thing to navigate. And I think that now that we have a significant German Jewish population, I mean, all the German big cities have been building synagogues. Now that we have a significant Muslim population that wants to be German, we are having to, I think, find a way towards a more positive understanding of the freedom of religion, as in the liberty to practice your religion visibly, without that, however, imposing on others. I mean, America knows from this, obviously. You've been negotiating this in very complex convolutions for decades now, and centuries, if you will. But we're only beginning to find that out. It's one of the areas where we can actually use some advice. But I think the European identity thing, to me, is not that difficult. It's protection of minorities, it's full political pluralism, it's representative democracy. You're a part of this, but you actually have to be able to fulfill that promise. And I think that's where we fell back. We didn't really work hard enough as majority societies, as host societies, in making that promise real. And of course, the advantage of making that real is that you can then actually crack down on the ones that are unwilling to integrate, or that in fact are working to undermine the system. That's, I think, where this is heading. But I think that with the migrant crisis has added an element of urgency, and an element of complexity to this problem, that while, as always, crises actually force people to act on insights that they've already have, the things that they need to do, but we're always pushing off. So to some degree, it's helping us push this through, but it's also, it's a really big challenge in terms of both complexity and change. And the reality is that the EU-Turkey deal on slowing down the influx, Turkey's role in Syria and Russia's role in Syria are the what do you call it? These are the levers on the pipeline, or the what do you call the wheels that you turn on a pipeline?
Valves.
The valves. Thank you. These are the valve points, and the Russians have been manipulating this exquisitely. We are fully aware in Europe and in Germany that it would be very easy to open the valve again by increasing the tensions in the region, and then we will have a very difficult time. Again, this is, I personally think that we can manage this. I actually think that Germany, despite much evidence to the contrary over the last year, has managed to deal with the first part of the migrant crisis quite well. But if the heat is driven up here, if the valves are opened, that'll put an enormous strain on the polity. So I don't want to make any promises here. But again, we can use all the help, we can use all the advice, the best practices, the experiences. I think we should share much more. And in general, I'm like Joao, I'm sort of reasonably hopeful that we can fix this. And I'm sorry, that was a much too long answer.
Oh, that's quite all right. Very good. Thank you. Let's try to get 2 questions on the table quickly, and then see if we can get a couple quick answers to those to close. So I see one question here and one question in the back there.
unfortunately, I'm an academic, so it's going to be a comment question. And the comment statement is something that the investor said. Populism actually is a very good scientific concept. I mean, in fact, I would go so far as to argue that if there's one concept and model that we have done a very good job at, and that is populism. And that is because we know that populism has several characteristics analytically. One is that populist
Sir,
things,
we really only have a couple minutes.
this is the question I'm going to get to. So I preface by saying I'm an academic, so I'm going to make a comment question. Okay? It's not going to be a long-winded thing, but still. And so populism always has something with shocks, context matters, and the reason I'm bringing this up, and this becomes a question part here, is that we need to be careful if we don't take what we've learned with populism as an analytical model and use it correctly, then we basically start going off on fishing expeditions about, well, why are these people angry? Why is this populist? And it's not always the same thing. And so that's the question here, is that context matters. There is no uniformity to the way we analyze populism, and we as social scientists have done a great job and have developed a good model in providing that.
All right, and the question back here.
Not sure, is it on? Yeah. In Amsterdam, there's a World War II monument that says when people remain silent before tyrants, they lose not only their life and possessions, the light is extinguished in the society. So we've talked about the methodology, about response, but what, apart from voting, are concrete steps that both elites and non-elites can take to stem the rise of populism?
All right, one or two brief answers?
Maybe a contribution which links to the previous but one question. I don't see this as something that is top-down, coming from European institutions telling the people what to do or where to vote. This is bound to be disastrous, and we have abandoned that ambition long time ago. No, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is a bottom-up one, and it has to do with grassroots, it has to do with political parties, it has to do with citizens' movements, NGOs, organized citizens, individual citizens, realizing that there's too much at stake for us to be silent and for us to be inactive. But it cannot be a top-down approach because of the complexity of the European reality. And if there's one thing we should fight back on populism, is that they propose simple solutions for complex problems. We cannot fall on that trap. We have to be realistic, saying these are complex issues. And Constance illustrated that very, very clearly. I mean, our societies are adjusting to 30 years of enormous changes. You know, what happened since 89, 90 is huge. You know, hyper-globalization, where trade grew faster than the economy. Telecommunications, technological revolutions, communication, financial markets, you name it. What happened in the last 3 decades is unbelievable. Someone would say huge. For our societies to accommodate and to adapt to. So we are going through a very difficult adjustment in all our societies, in Europe as much as US. So there are no easy solutions for these problems, and we need to realize that. But the effort, trying to reply to your question, the effort has to come from all of us. And this is one contribution to it, to try to understand better what we're dealing with. When I mention difficulties with the concept of populism, is that populism sometimes means something in Europe and a different thing here, like liberalism or liberal, being liberal. There are issues of language across the Atlantic that I need to be very careful. Living in this country now for more than 6 years, I sometimes fall into these traps of linguistic issues. So I'm not underestimating the efforts from your community, academic community, to try to conceptualize populism.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our second panel. Please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.
And lunch will be served shortly.
Test. Well, good afternoon. It's great to be back. We were just talking a little bit about what haven't we covered, because it's been such a really tremendously rich discussion this morning about so many different aspects of populism in Europe, in Asia, the politics of it, the impact on it. But one of the issues that's kind of been missing, maybe we should start there, Robin, is the media. And sort of the role that the media, and I think social media, plays in changing the nature of the debate and the impact it has. I mean, we seem to be living in a world in which the sort of the mediating impact of the media that we used to have, where the media was sort of looked at as a source of truth, wisdom, at least accepted as such, that's disappearing. And is that maybe one of the reasons why we see these movements rising up, not only by being able to rise up, but getting the traction that they have? How do you see this?
I think undoubtedly we're in an era where people are starting to pick their news. And technology, which has been such a great dimension of globalization, has provided so much opportunity to so many people, is also allowing, as I think most people here would recognize, a re-tribalization of politics, and also a loss of control by political parties of key messages that would determine where the edges of that political tribe might be and not be. So I think of the UK, obviously, where I'm based, notions of right and left starting to erode. The control of the media was already weakening because of their loss of advertising revenue, et cetera, and therefore looking for the stronger stories. But it's interesting, the contrast, because here when everyone's saying, well, the media is all anti-Trump and is very liberal in as we would call it in the UK, whereas in the UK the bulk of the press was in favor of Brexit. Whether either of them is going to make the critical difference, though, I think is definitely a moot point. And when I think of the change at the moment, that ability to go back and say, can we reboot the narrative and allow this just to be a moment of maybe post-global financial crisis, post-Afghanistan, Iraq, loss of trust, and somehow the old parties will just regain control. I don't see how they're going to do it in the kind of media world that you just mentioned.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we do live in a very different world. We don't have. There was a very good article, by the way, in The Atlantic by Jonathan Rauch about the loss of our mediating institutions in American politics, political parties, the media, primary systems that actually were depoliticized, or where parties were still important, lobbyists, all those things that used to make the system work have disappeared. And the media in particular, as you said, you can now pick your own news. You don't actually have to turn on CBS News and listen to Walter Cronkite tell you what happened, and you come back and say, okay, well, no, that's what happened. You just go to whatever source you have yourself. And I think the power of Twitter, the power of Facebook, particularly in this election in the United States, where Donald Trump is directly speaking to his followers without the mediating influence of anyone trying to explain and understand it, is pretty remarkable. It's I think is part of how you get populism going. If populism depends in part on a leader, and if a leader can communicate directly with his or her followers, it is likely that they live in their own bubble. Mm-hmm. And that bubble it gets more and more powerful. I think that's the phenomenon of Donald Trump. It's the phenomenon in my own former country in the Netherlands of Geert Wilders, who is able, and in fact his predecessor, Pim Fortuyn, in this populist movement, was able to speak directly to the people. And that ability to do so places the media in a very different place, and the place where it's no longer even the arbiter of truth.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's, we've got Constanza here, I think still here, Strotterman, or maybe if not.
No, she's getting coffee, so yes.
But if I remember rightly, Constanza, there was this wonderful thing called a pirate party in Berlin, was particularly successful briefly in Berlin. But they came up with this great concept of liquid democracy. The idea that people would organize and flow around particular issues, campaign for them, succeed in getting them or not, but then it would just disappear again. And so political parties are unable to capture, to move, to organize, let go. It was an online form of organization, minimal amount of money. Now the pirate party, I think, has disappeared. So sustaining this is particularly difficult. But for most young people these days, I think of my daughters, they're becoming more politicized, but not political in terms of belonging to one party or another.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And then the parties, quote, that are winning are new. They're different. They're playing in a different place. Beppe Grillo and the Five-Star Movement in Italy started as, Beppe Grillo is a comedian, and started as a Facebook movement, literally as a Facebook movement, and has continued to, in some ways, capture that reality. So this is our challenge.
What do you make then of the stories that, in a way, this is, for the Donald Trump campaign, this has been somewhat a potential opportunity then to harvest this into media? So the two sides are now playing, it was media controlling politics, but now politics are moving into media.
Well, nothing would surprise me with Donald Trump. It hasn't since June of 2015. But I can see, and I think this is true for a lot of populist leaders, if they lose out in the political game, the popularity that has been gained may be translated into something new. And whether that is Trump TV or some other new media venture, I think that's something to look forward to or not, depending on your point of view. But it goes again to this issue that whereas traditionally waiting for the 6 o'clock news from your three broadcasters here in the United States, or the newspaper plopping on your front door, and that being the fundamental source of all information that people had, that's changed. Yeah. Because you can now find your own information. You can find your own facts wherever you are trying to look at. And I don't think our political process is really caught up with that fundamental reality, which makes it easier, it seems to me, for populism to not only rise, but thrive.
I think also, just one more point on this, the issue of what are facts and what are experts. Some of this was mentioned in one of the first panels where Michael Gove, one of our leaving campaign people, proclaimed that experts, who needs them? But the problem with facts as well is how it plays to what are meant to be neutral organizations. News were about presenting facts neutrally and then allowing people to draw the conclusions. But in this more populist space, one of the accusations leveled against a great British institution, the BBC, was of indulging in balanced bias. Yeah. You may know this term, balanced bias. So the idea that there are a number of economists who believe that leaving is good, and there are some economists who believe that leaving is bad. And if you had to present the two things as being balanced, because that was the role of trying to give people the space to then make their own decision. But it'd be a bit like saying, there are scientists, some scientists think climate change isn't happening, and some think it is. So this whole issue of where facts start and whether facts are completely neutral, or whether the opinion, in a way, if it's strongly held, as somebody said, emotionally held, it becomes true. It's just a fascinating space.
It is, and I think we've lost, and I'm not sure how we get it back, but it seems to me we have lost this trust, this confidence in established media institutions to do the hard work of separating fact from fiction for us. But that leads to, I think, a larger question, which is that, and that brought up, Constanza brought it up, others brought it up earlier, is the social contract. We used to have a social contract between government and the governed, in which there was a general expectation. John Judas talked about this general expectation that the system would provide for the people, and it would continue to provide over time in whether it was on the social side or on the economic side, but it would provide. And therefore there was a basic trust in the system doing it right. seems to me that trust is gone, that the social contract is under a fundamental attack, that is what populism is about. It's about the governed no longer believing that government is able to provide for them in the way that they thought necessary and right, and therefore wants to take the matters in one's own hand. And it's true on the left, it's true on the right. Frankly, it's true increasingly on the center, where the inability of government to provide raises the question of, so why are we even working with these institutions? If you see it that way, let's unpack that a little bit and start with your own country and the question of the social welfare state, which is part of that social contract, and how do we restore it? If it's broken, how do we get the government social contract back into place?
Well, I think you'd have to start with governments telling the truth about the limits of their power. But in democratic societies, people expect their governments to say, look, this is how I'm going to fix it for you, as opposed to, this is really difficult to fix. It could take a generation. And in the meantime, you guys need to do more. I mean, that's where we're at, I think, not just in the UK, but in Europe as a whole. The UK was rebuilt in a very European way after the Second World War as a welfare state. We are very European in the UK in believing the National Health Service is close to a religiously held belief system, and no one can touch it. But the fact of the matter is, it's not going to be affordable in the way that it has been so far, and there will have to be some element of co-payment, some element of determining who should and shouldn't have access to it. But right now, anyone can get access to anything, not at any time, but at least financially they can. So the concept that the welfare state, which I think was affordable when countries like the UK, most European countries, and the US were at the top of the globalization locomotive. We were in the first carriage because we industrialized first, because we traded first, on the back of industrialization. The sense was that everyone would be pulled along in that globalization carriage, but the Europeans would get to stay in the front one. Because we're in the front, we could have enough money to then pay for the social services. But of course, globalization has ripped that apart and created a global workforce. And there's an intermingling of the well-off and the less well-off across all carriages. And in that structure, you potentially do not have the money to pay for the welfare system you need. As the British government may find out soon, if large chunks of the financial services industry leave the UK, 1% of British taxpayers account for about 25% of government income tax. The top 5% account for about 45-50%. So that deal is not being explained. So in a way, I think this populism is arriving at a time, certainly from a European standpoint, where the idea of the welfare state is, if not eroding, is pretty much gone. Demographic, aging, overly generous, you might argue, systems that are not affordable at least, it's going to be a real challenge. The US, of course, is not unlike the UK, a kind of welfare state. It's never been thought of as that. So what's the deal? What's the deal in the US that's breaking? What's the social contract that's broken here?
Well, I mean, the social contract here was that a rising tide does lift all boats, that the idea that the economy would continue to grow over time, that everyone could participate within that economy, that over time you could have enough income to send your kids to school, to have them go to college, to have a relatively decent retirement, and that was something that was true not only for the managerial class, but it was true for the working class. And the changing economy clearly, and so that the welfare of the entire society was part of the overall growth of the system. And that growth really stopped for a large part of Americans, a majority of Americans, about 25 years ago. So you didn't have that rising living standard. You didn't have the possibility of folks buying their own home, having their kids go to school, going to college, or at least it was becoming more difficult. It was taking not one income, but two incomes. and therefore women joined the workforce, in part for economic reasons, which created new obligations of childcare, which wasn't taken care of, vulnerabilities that if one or the other fell out of the workforce because of an illness or the need to take care of a parent, the ability to maintain that standard of living became less and less. So that social contract, which was a growing economy will lift everyone up over time, has disappeared in a pretty fundamental way. And then the challenge of populism is to say we need to change the system because some are benefiting and we're not. And it's a distributional issue, which in Europe, frankly, is something that has been on the top of the agenda for a very long time, really hasn't been at the top of the agenda for the United States in the social contract. How does the state distribute the gains of globalization, the gains of economic growth, which are disproportionately falling to one part of society and against another? Those are big questions. I think the second big question, which in this election, interestingly enough, at least in rhetoric, is being addressed, is the one that Constanze talked about with regard to infrastructure. So both candidates are making large noises of investing in infrastructure and the need to have better roads, better rails, better airports, better social and physical infrastructure. What we haven't figured out yet, who's going to pay for it, how are we going to pay for it, how are you going to make the political decisions to pay for it, because the worry is that if you pay for it with one bucket, the people who happen to hold that bucket are going to protest. But at least you're starting to get a debate and a recognition that there is a need for society as a whole to take care of some of the common and public goods in a way that we haven't seen for quite a while.
I mean, I think in Europe, and I would include Britain in Europe on this point, the idea was that government was there to protect you. And where you're saying government is almost there to sort of keep out of the way but enable the market forces to unleash their ever-growing opportunities for their citizens. I think there's always been that suspicion about the market in Europe, including in the UK, and therefore government was there to try and police it and manage it. And part of the rise of populism is the realization that government, and neither national government nor EU government, with its potential notions of fortress Europe, neither of them are providing that protection that was expected before. And so if politicians have not yet admitted that the social welfare state is not going to be affordable in the same way it was before, there's always a mismatch between what they're saying and what people see day to day in their lives. I mean, it's remarkable to see someone like Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, now creating a ministry that has the word industrial policy in it. You know, a Conservative government is going to pursue industrial policy. A Conservative government is going to try and get workers' representatives onto corporate boards. I mean, this is unheard of in the UK system. Margaret Thatcher would be turning in her grave, most probably. But it gives you a sense that whereas Leave was partly about Britain taking back control from this other EU, actually government is trying to think, how do we take back control over the market domestically at the same time? Whether these answers will work or not is another matter, but she's saying what people want to hear.
Which is interesting, and the politics is clearly shifting over there. Our politics, I think, are trying to define where we want to go, and I think after this election, which was a little different than most of our elections, that is going to be the question facing both of our political parties, on the Republican side and the Democratic side. The idea that somehow one party has figured it out and the other one is in crisis, I think, misses the point that we have moved from a real division between left and right to a bigger division, different division of open versus closed, as we call it. And there is the question, the larger question, of where does that all lead internationally? And I want to, before we open it up, really spend a few minutes on this issue. You know, for 70 years, we have had an international philosophy led by the UK and the United States in many ways, that opening our borders to trade, to people, to liberal influences, not only our borders but every other's borders, is the key to order, to security, to prosperity. It's what the European Union was based on. It's what the institutions of the post-war period were built on, whether the United Nations or the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs or the Bretton Woods financial system or the alliance system that the United States and its allies built, not only in Europe but in Asia and tried even in the Middle East. This notion that we needed to together try to open up the system. And it has been tremendously successful, I think, as we all recognize. It banished war in Europe, which was an extraordinary achievement. It has been at the core of prosperity throughout the world, including in China, which by opening up created 500 million middle-class folks and reduced poverty at a rate that we haven't seen in history. And this is being challenged. It's being challenged everywhere. I was just in Hong Kong and Singapore, where the issues of immigration, whether it's from mainland China and Hong Kong or from all over the world to Singapore, are becoming politically important parts of what's happening. And populism is kind of driven not just by we're against the elite, but we're against the other, as we discussed in the first debate. And the other we exclude. So we're trying to close our borders. We're trying to keep people out. So the very fundamental liberalism, openness of the post-war period is being threatened here. Is that how you see it? And if so, where do you think this is going, and how do we get it back?
I mean, I agree with the basic layout. I think we need to remember that this order, the liberal international order of open markets, etc., looked especially good from the West point of view, because I said earlier, we were at the top. Yeah. We were in the peak. We sold the value-added stuff to other people who sold us the less value-added stuff. A bit of an extension of British Empire those days. We were a great proud trading nation. We'd send the gunboats in if people wouldn't trade with us, basically. That's the kind of trading we often did in the 19th century. And what I think people didn't spot happen was that actually as you took globalization, as you took open markets beyond our economies and into China, into India, into Vietnam, into other parts of the world, we were actually undercutting large segments of our own societies in their ability to benefit as well as the rest of the country did. There's this weird thing that's emerged, the way I think about it is that globalization brings about aggregate benefits, but it doesn't necessarily bring about local benefits. The pro-Remain camp in the UK would keep saying, look, we've got the lowest unemployment of the EU, highest rate of GDP growth, attract the most foreign investment in the EU. What's the problem? And as one person said at a rally there, he said, that's your GDP, mate, not mine. Mm-hmm. Yeah? From the perspective of individuals, their specific circumstances weren't improving, even though the aggregate position of the UK was. So I think we're shifting now to a position where our societies look at other governments that are trying to control the process of the open markets and saying, maybe we should be doing some control as well. Chinese opened up, but now they'll do a bit of indigenization. They'll stop foreign investment in certain areas. The French have always said, you need to balance the market with state intervention. I heard one German diplomat say at a dinner that we have to recognize that maybe Putin's been avant-garde in certain areas. It wasn't saying in a complimentary way, I might add, but that mixing that idea that you need to protect your society from globalization and play up the sovereignty element, that is coming about. And one other point I'd make, and see if you agree with this or not, the expectation was that as we allowed the Western liberal type of globalization to take place, other societies would turn into our political model. And China is proving to be the contradiction to that viewpoint, at least for now. So it's no wonder that people are questioning whether this is working or not. Same thing in the US, I presume.
Yeah, no, I think that the exact same phenomenon is happening, and you're right. I think there was an ideological predisposition to believe that as markets opened, politics would follow. That with open markets, you get open politics. And we now see that the two great forces of illiberalism are the very two countries where we tried to do that. We started in Russia, where after 1989, a fundamental belief, and go back to the Nixon memo, where Nixon wrote a memo to Bill Clinton in 1992 to say that if you work with the Russians to open economic systems, then the political change will come. And we did open the political system. In fact, ultimately it took a while, but we brought Russia into the World Trading Organization, and the system has not followed politically. In fact, to the contrary.
It's our systems that are changing.
Our systems are changing, and in fact, they're being bought, it seems to me, by those very illiberal forces in Russia. So it didn't work in Russia. The idea that Russia, through economic market involvement through trade, would somehow open up politically and then integrate into the West, my view strongly is that experiment after 25 years has failed. The Russians aren't interested in integrating in the West. They want to be who they are, and they will control their economic, social, political, and foreign policy system in their own way. The same is true in China, where I remember Bill Clinton running an extraordinary campaign in 98 and 99 to get China into the WTO. And it was all based on this argument that open trade and open borders would lead to open politics. It would mean a fundamental change. And in fact, it hasn't. Today, the political system in China is more closed than it was before. The nationalism is increasing as a means of controlling the negative forces seen by the state. So you have a rise of illiberalism in both Russia and China at a very time when we thought that liberalism was going to open up that system. And that, it seems to me, is our big challenge. The model that says if everybody just follows what we've been doing for the last 70 years, it will be fine. That model is no longer as viable as it once was, and it raises questions about whether you go back to a more balance of power model, or whether you try to open up these societies in a different way. And I think that's the moment we're at.
And the irony, in a way, is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership could be interpreted as the two key efforts to try to consolidate the liberal international order amongst themselves and say, we're going to move just from being countries that rely on trading in goods and investment as automatically helping us increase our welfare and our security, and we're actually going to try to integrate our rulemaking to a certain extent so that we provide a large, almost continent of rulemaking that can then set the terms for others. So I always saw TTIP and TPP at least as an effort to adapt the liberal international order project to try and give it a little bit more momentum or even staying power for the future. And if those two things go or don't take place, the danger is the US and Europe close in a little bit on themselves and say, well, look, we need to fix ourselves for this next 5-10 year period. And then you do end up in quite a balance of power-y kind of world, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think TTIP and TPP were seen as sort of the logical extension of the globalization dynamic, and to try to get it right for both Asia and Europe, with the United States as the pivot in between. Nice word, by the way. But it was the pivot in between. That is, it was going both to Europe and to Asia. And frankly, on both, the prospects of both of these agreements, though, we liberal internationalists, at least I count myself among them, believe these agreements are extremely important. And yet, neither the politics at home nor anywhere else seems to favor this extension, and that raises the question, what kind of world, if this is no longer the leitmotif of our international engagement, what kind of world are we heading into, particularly as our politics at home says we need to fix things at home? That's the debate, it seems to me, between open and closed between let's figure out what we're doing at home. I think that's true in Britain with Brexit. It's true with the European Union and trying to save its issues. It's true with our country. No matter who wins this presidency, we're going to have to concentrate at home. And that puts into question the liberal project that for 70 years the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe have been pushing forward. It's a bicycle. I mean, this is a hypothesis, right? If you stop pedaling, you tend to fall over.
That's the kind of argument that let Brexit happen. You've got to keep integrating more. If you don't integrate more, eventually EU will collapse. And
well, that's where our politics are heading. Let's open up the floor. We have about almost a half an hour. So let's broaden out this discussion. We'll go to Sasha first over here, and then over on the left, right here.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting, particularly the proposition or idea that the liberal model has failed to prove its power by failing in Russia and China. That is, that it seems to me that for a long time, at least in this kind of discourse, democracy and capitalism were interchangeable. They were mutually enforcing, as it were. But something happened so that they could be decoupled. So there's capitalism thriving in China and to some extent in Russia, but democracy does not go with that. But here's my question, a proposition. I have a sense that the decoupling has started here a while ago, and that Trump and populism we're talking about is part of that process. That democracy and capitalism have reached a point where they might be mutually exclusive. So that left populism would choose democracy over capitalism, whereas the right populism was leaning toward capitalism over democracy. It's able to imagine a country where democracy is less important than capitalism. It seems to me that it didn't start, it intensified during the Bush years. It's a different conversation when and how it started, if it started then. But I would like to talk a little more about this decoupling of democracy and capitalism, because now it's hard to sustain that model. Democracy without capitalism is possible, as is capitalism without democracy.
You want to?
Okay, thank you.
I'll
go for it. There's, as you know, this debate about the trilemma. Can you have democracy, sovereignty, globalization? Can those things be sustained for the long term or not? Again, speaking as a European, I don't think capitalism has been the core driver as much as extending the principles of democracy into the economic space as well. Rule of law, transparency. But I would say from a European standpoint, which is why we've talked ourselves as welfare states, that we're having to become welfare societies, probably, would be the right term to use today. There's always been a role for government in trying to police the rules. And I don't just mean government as an executive, but checked and balanced to government, courts, legislature, executive, that if you could create a self-reinforcing system in which individuals and companies can pursue the future without being centrally controlled, but at least being protected, if you want to say, in terms of the rules of the road being protected, that was the perfection that I suppose that we've been aiming for. And I think as a European, I would say that it's not been how do we sustain democracy and capitalism, because capitalism to many Europeans sounds like uncontrolled economic activity, where actually government's always trying to take itself out of the way, and that somehow the top down, if you let the markets work, things will come out in the wash. People didn't believe that in Europe in general, and therefore maybe are more ready to adapt to this sort of hybrid world we're heading into. I think the question I throw over to Ivo is, capitalism is something that's been associated, especially with the US, maybe with the Anglo-Saxons, so I think the Brits are always a little bit on the edge of that and pretended rather than really believed it. But for America, capitalism, Ivo, has been central, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you have to define what capitalism means. I mean, if you do it in terms of its old old-fashioned way, as described by our good friend Carl and Friedrich, good friends Carl and Friedrich, which is basically that the means of production are owned privately. That is, if that's the only thing that matters, you miss a lot of what we really talk about, which is the market democracies, which tries to put together the market piece, which is regulated, though in the United States much freer and much less interference from the state, certainly of control of any private enterprise where it is removed. And then the raw form of capitalism, which I think has a problem for, had a problem here. That's why we had the Great Depression and we had the regulations, formation of unions, and the whole system that came with it. I think the argument I would have is the belief still fundamentally, and I would believe myself, that market and democracy, good markets and good democracy have to go together. Because it drives innovation, it drives distributional systems, and doesn't really work without it. The problem, I would argue, with China and Russia is they're really not the kind of market, let alone market democracies, that we have seen in the West, and here I include Japan and increasingly South Korea, but also, of course, the European Union and the United States and Canada and Mexico, in the sense that the state is still a major player in both of those economies and are distorting the markets in very fundamental ways, whether it's in currency, whether it's in terms of trade, whether it's in dumping steel, whether it is in the kleptocracy that runs Russia, where to talk about capitalism there in a true market sense is somewhat laughable. And that would make me argue that the liberal ideal probably is still the right way to think about it, which is that if you get a true market opening, you only can have that with the political opening that has to come with it. And in fact, political forces are stronger in these societies. They may generate a lot of wealth for a lot of people, but they also generate a lot of problems. In Russia, kleptocratic problems, I think in China, having to do with social dislocation and environmental destruction, that one still has to live with.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on with this thing.
Yeah, over thanks.
It sounds like the Western world, the anti-populism world, needs a good public relations firm. The EU ambassador said he didn't sell the reason to stay, even though there were lots of facts. One of the first panelists this morning said there's no clear ideological position to defend not only the status quo, but to justify moving forward. This despite the fact that Hillary has a very specific and very thorough plan for moving ahead in this era of change. My question is, given your panel, the implications of populism, in this world of huge, fundamental, rapid change that's too fast for most people, what is the psychological construct? What is the cultural context? What is the message, the concept that we're missing? What do we need by way of a public relations message and program to sell what is good about where we're headed and what's bad about populism?
So let me start off and maybe in some sense betraying my age. But certainly from somebody of mine or the older generations, the argument that Constance made still seems to me the fundamental argument that you have to make, which is that what we have accomplished over the past 70 years is the abolition of the use of force to settle our internal differences. And when you look at that from a historical perspective, it is truly astonishing. And if you looked at in Europe, where the 70 years of prosperity and peace that has come after the most destructive 70 years in history, of World War I and World War II, and in fact the wars that preceded World War I, and that we have found a new way of interacting as states. And we have done that through an openness of goods and people, capital, regulated by joint agreement. And that we solve our differences by coming to the table and trying to resolve those through discussion and negotiation rather than, as we used to do, shooting ourselves. I don't know if anybody has seen Hamilton yet, but we know how we used to solve our differences. We did it through duels. Well, we don't do that anymore, not at home here, and we don't do it, and we shouldn't be doing it in international affairs, and that the idea is not that grievances that lead to populist movements should be ignored. To the contrary, they need to be dealt with, and I think our failure is not necessarily the lack of a narrative. It's the fact that we haven't dealt with the problems that are pretty obvious for all of us to see. The fact that the distribution of income has gone absolutely haywire, in which the very few have benefited greatly, but the many have not, and that is very different from what it was just 30 or 40 years ago. But it seems to me the system eliminated war from which is pretty unique historically. It's just extraordinary from the nature of the relationship. And that needs to be at the center of the narrative. I also recognize, having two millennials myself, Schraub's point about the importance to understand what we have. That, if you live in Europe, or if you live today, it is as easily to go to Bristol or Birmingham as it is to go to Bologna or Berlin or even Boston. It's remarkable. 30 years ago, that was unaffordable and nobody did it. And now we have that system. So we need to spend more time talking about what we have, why it matters, and recognize that we also have to deal with the problems that are real and leading to the populist movements. A big agenda. But at least we should start with the fact that what we build is not necessarily a bad thing. And before we tear it down, we better understand what it is. Bill Singer.
Both of you used the word fix it, which implies to me that globalization, liberalism should be kept but fixed, in the sense that the negative aspects of it, like in trade, have to be fixed. In the U.S. context, I can't speak to Britain as well, but in the U.S. context, it seems like the impossibility of that, given the anti-government fervor on one side, preventing the government from doing the fix. If that isn't possible, how do you fix it?
So I actually think we need to remember that politics and government in the United States happens in other places than Washington as well. And so if Washington is stuck politically, and we can have a long argument about why, but let's grant for the moment that it is, and I take it, Bill, that's your point. There are other parts of government that are not broken. And I would start at the most basic form of government, which is local. And I think there is a role for local government to play to deal with the challenges that we have. In fact, I think there's an increasing role just because of the nature of globalization, particularly for cities. It's one of the reasons we at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs are spending time thinking about cities. Our inequality is taking place in our cities. Most of the infrastructure problems that need to work need to be fixed in our cities. So there's a lot that we can start doing at this level in those states where they function and that we don't have the political paralysis as we may have here. States can do so. If you look at California as an example of a state that fixed its politics, But secondly, as a state that is taking on humongous problems in a non-political way, or willing to take them on in a non-political way, they're fixing things. So I don't think there's anything inherent in our ability not to address these challenges. I would like to do it at the national level, because it'd be a lot easier if the national government were to work. But if it doesn't work, then let's look at other levels of government as means to resolve this. And oh, by the way, those other levels in government don't have to think about themselves only in national terms. They can think of themselves in international terms, which is exactly what's happening with cities and climate change. There are 80 cities, 80-some cities that are getting together under the C40 initiative to try to learn from each other how to address the issue of climate change. And they're driving much of the agenda of how to change, how to adapt to, mitigate the consequences of climate change. And that's what you want to see. So while governments try to figure out how to negotiate agreements at the national level, implementation is happening at a subnational level across borders, which is in some ways the new liberal politics, or not even liberal, the new politics of international interaction.
Yeah, and just to tack onto this, you say, how do we fix it? I think most governments in Europe know what it is they've got to do. As I said, I think in a way we've been trying to avoid doing what we know what we have to do in Europe for a long time. And the credit binge that a lot of Europe, not all of Europe, a lot of Europe indulged in the 2000s was the latest activity of displacement to try to drum up growth without tackling the really structural reforms that need to be undertaken on pensions, on opening up closed services markets, on labor markets, on infrastructure, on education, in particular education, primary and secondary education in the UK, higher education in parts of continental Europe. We all know what the mix of things is that need to be done. In a way, many European countries were able to get away without doing it, partly because they were disguised inside a single market that drove a little bit of gains of efficiency in the 90s and early 2000s, but soon that extra kick into the economy ran out because of these structural weaknesses. And we're now finally, I suppose, all of us, trying to catch up with taking very difficult changes that governments have not spent time arguing to their publics needed to be undertaken. And there's no wonder then that populist politics steps in when at the last minute there's such a disconnect between what governments have been saying is fine and the reality that people experience from a day-to-day basis. So we've kind of in a way waited for markets to fix the problem in Europe. Governments, I think, are becoming more actively involved. But the question is, how do you do that and yet still sustain that liberal market aspect that Ivo was talking about before? And here, I think what's so different between the West and the liberal international order and let's call it the illiberal one, is this putting individuals at the heart of all policy. So the freedom of the individual, the opportunity for the individual, and protection of those individuals who don't have opportunity is the absolutely central difference. That even if government is meant to be providing change, government cannot be entirely trusted. Government must be checked, must be balanced. And I think in the UK, there's a realization that even a place like Britain was way too centrally governed. And the irony is the Cameron government was just starting to decentralize British government as this Brexit vote took place. There'll be a question as to whether Theresa May will keep it going or not. We're having some elections for mayors, devolution of power to the regions, greater power for the nation of Scotland, the Welsh Assembly. I completely agree with you that part of the change is going to have to be in sync in a way with that core principle of the freedom of the individual and the decentralization factor. That'll be the element of the future, I think.
Just related back to populism for a second. If populism, as Truman rightly put it, is about identity, we live in a world in which everyone has multiple identities. We are no longer just an American or a Frenchman or a Portuguese. Our identities start with our families, with our religious communities, in political terms, with the cities, with the states, with the nations, and with the larger international community in which we belong. And in Europe, it is completely common to be to be European and a Londoner and a Brit and an Englishman, all at the same time. And in fact, as the current mayor of London puts it, he is a father, a son of Pakistani bus drivers, and a Muslim, and a Londoner, and an Englander, and a European, and a citizen of the world, which apparently these days we're not allowed to say anymore, at least in some parts of the world. And it's those multiple identities that should help one to find ways in which to resolve the political disputes. If they don't happen at the national level, maybe they can happen at the international level, or in fact on the subnational level. That's the challenge of international politics, it seems to me, today.
Yeah.
Jerry.
There's been a lot of angst and hand-wringing over this current presidential election in the United States. But I think it's also clear that both parties understand that there's a problem here now. What do you think the potential is, or the probability is, that this election could actually act as a pivot point in terms of solving some of the problems that are driving this anger?
You know, that's a big question, and I mean, one, I am not sure that the parties recognize as much as you recognize. That is, I don't necessarily think that either the Republican or the Democratic Party, and they're both, that they look at this election as something that has to do with them, as opposed to with the individuals who happen to be running. But assume for a moment that they do. Then I think my view is that you can't solve this within the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. That if you really want to deal with this issue, you'll have to have a realignment, and a pretty significant realignment that's no longer along the economic axis, which is where party politics used to be determined, which is a certain group of you cannot tell who is a Democrat or Republican based on economic status today. It's impossible, right? A working class person used to be a Democrat. Who knows whether a Democrat or Republican? So the parties have broken down on the traditional socioeconomic divide. That's gone. So you need to find what's the new divide in which you're going to organize politically. Frankly, I don't know. I just don't think it's where they are today. But unless both parties recognize the need to really fundamentally adapt and capture part of the vote that both of them lost. Remember that Hillary Clinton, who ran against and had a very tough campaign and almost lost against a guy who hadn't been a Democrat until a few weeks before he decided to run, who was able to mobilize an extraordinary constituency of young people across the board, a 74-year-old guy. That should tell any Democrat, if they think they don't have an issue, that they have an issue with the nature of the party. And we don't have to talk about the Republican side where the differences are pretty self-evident. So this may be the beginning of a realignment, but with usual realignments, they're much easier to recognize after they've happened than to predict them before they take place.
And can I just comment on this, because there is an interesting parallelism. You said, will the US election lead to a change? The big question is happening in the UK. Will Brexit lead to a change in Britain? Will the shock of Brexit, because it came obviously as a shock to the political establishment, will that drive change that in some ways should have been able to happen without Brexit? Others and I have made the point that you didn't need to leave the EU in order to be able to build a third runway for Heathrow, or to be able to invest in new energy infrastructure in the UK, or get our primary education in better shape, or get long-term financing, or heal the divide between North and South of the UK. All of those things could be done inside the EU. But the fact is, British politicians, somewhere along the way, lost their sense of agency, their sense that they were sort of in charge. And we've not used the phrase, I don't think I've heard it yet, that absolutely animated this campaign about taking back control. It was a way of saying to that subliminal message to all individuals in the UK, we're going to help you take back control over your life by us taking back control, even though the control is amorphous and even unreal. But it's interesting to see in the UK right now a country, in many cases, those who argued Remain, probably even more seriously than those who argued Leave, trying to work out how can we fix the country. This was a revolutionary call. It was where we know this may be bad for the country. We hear the arguments of everyone, but we don't care. We want to rip it up because what we've got now isn't good enough. And Theresa May, one can discuss the tactics of what she's doing, whether they're right or wrong, whether they're balanced appropriately or not. I think she's trying to use this vote as a way of redefining politics in Britain and redefining what the responsibility of politicians is. And it's more activist. It is more activist. And it is, just to your other point, if I can pivot for a second, Ivo, more about identity. And the idea that if you don't have a sense of identity, if you don't have a sense of belonging, you may not have the political agency to drive change. The driving change technocratically, citizens of the world, is not the same as driving change when you feel it's part of a national mission. And this is the dangerous part of people looking at Russia or China and saying, oh, these are countries that are motivated, mobilized by strong leaders. We don't have strong leaders, so we can't be mobilized. I think the West is really struggling with this dilemma. How do you drive change? How do you mobilize politicians? How do you mobilize people to do really difficult change without and not lose what makes us liberal democracies, which I think is the most sustainable and best system that's out there.
Robin, thanks so much for joining me here, all of us, for what I thought was a fascinating discussion, ending a fascinating day with terrific speakers. I want to thank all of you calling from far and close by to be with us here today to talk about a topic that I'm sure we will return to many, many times in the years ahead. Thank you all for participating. Let me ask you, if you could, to also thank a terrific staff that works day in and day out every day to make this possible, and particularly since it is her last day, almost last day here at the Council. This is a capstone. Famila Golic has worked with us here. She was a leader in this effort. Thanks so much for what you have done for the Council for so many years, and for everyone else today to make this such a great success. Thank you.